For starters, I'm using the Dawn of the Emperor DM's book timeline rather than the player's book because the player's book is about as biased as it gets. Phaeacians aren't the most trustworthy historians, and the official histories reflect that perfectly, but I won't be spoiling too much, just the ancient history that has no effect on the players. Thyatis actually starts on the southern continent of Divania, where they existed as three separate tribes named after the mountains that they each lived near, the Phaeacians, the Corindans, and the Haedians. They were part of the Millennian Empire for an indeterminate amount of time before they rebelled against the Millennians and fled north to the continent of Brune, where they established the nation and the regions that now bear their name. The Millennian Empire fell apart shortly after the Phaeacians left, resulting in the nation largely being transported to the Hollow World. Thyatis then became three nations, who were allied but they were separate. They had a strong history of piracy and were known as fierce warriors. With the arrival of the Alphatians, they found a new nation to attack and plunder, at least until the Alphatians grew tired of being attacked and decided the Thyacians would make wonderful new slaves. And like current-day, Alphatian troops proved to be no match for the Thyacian warriors, but the Alphatian wizards have no equal among the Thyacians. Thyatis and its provinces all fell in the year 192 BC. Almost 200 years passed with Thyatis under the boot heel of the Alphatians. Finally, the governor of Corindus, Licinius Transantibium, stages an uprising with the help of his friend and ally, Zendralian Tratioconatus. Instead of military might, they first used trickery and guile by eliminating the few Alphatian wizards ruling over them locally that aren't addicted to Zonga. This addiction to Zonga has crippled the Alphatian Empire, and the nation has fell into apathy, as it is famous for doing. The Alphatian Emperor was also taxing his subjects to the brink of revolt anyway, so it didn't take much to foment revolt. Licinius began assassinating Alphatian governors in a series of rigged duels where the drugged Alphatians stood no chance. When the Alphatians sent a fleet to crush the fledgling rebellion, Phaeacian trickery and its skill at arms destroyed the Alphatian fleet as it arrived. Seeing Alphatia could be defeated, provinces all over the Alphatian Empire rose up in rebellion. Alphatia found itself short on allies, magic, gold, and soldiers, putting down all the revolts all over the empire. The old Alphatian emperor was deposed by his own people, and his successors sued for peace. Thyatis had won. During the revolt, Licinius had gained allies with Oechalia and the Pearl Islands, who expected their freedom from Alphatia if Thyatis had won. This would have been the case except for during a summit between the three powers, Licinius's friend, quote-unquote, and General Zendralian committed the most famous piece of treachery in the empire, assassinating Licinius and the kings of his allies, claiming the imperial throne for himself and taking over all the Phaeacian provinces. Zendralian then began a rapid expanse of the empire, while part of the empire found themselves in open revolt. The empire threatened to come apart at the seams because of his treachery, but 20 years after he grabbed power, he dies of natural causes. This leads to his wife, Valentia, gaining the throne. She quickly turns around the fortunes of Thyatis, regaining the nobles' loyalty by either bribes, threats, or example. She proves to be one of Thyatis' greatest leaders, giving her the moniker Valentia the Crusader by historians. She sets the standard for future Thyacian leaders, leaving the empire at one of its highest peaks when she finally leaves the throne. The empire begins to expand in AC 150, starting with the invasion of Eularum. Alphatia sees the expansion of Thyatis as a threat, and in return invades the northern part of Eularum, splitting the smaller nation between the two empires, and starting a border war that Eularum still bears the scars of even today. Thyatis gains a reputation for harsh reprisal that is exemplified with the Hattian revolt in AC 313, when the entire province declares that it's independent and rejects Thyacian culture. The response is to send in multiple legions to the island that proceed to sack every single city in the province, as well as throw down every city wall in Hattius. To drive the point home after the culling of the Hattian leadership, the province is forever forbidden from building city walls again, a law that is still in effect even 7 centuries later. Thyatis expands even further in 571 AC with the conquest of Eirindi. While it turns out to be cost prohibitive to completely occupy the islands, Thyatis instead creates numerous penal colonies and ships over large numbers of its criminals, fully expecting them to die of tropical disease. The prisoners are abandoned to their fate for the most part. In addition, Thyatis claims parts of the 5 Shires, even though it doesn't press into the mainland there. 3 decades later, the Eirindi revolt, pushing off the Thyacians. The initial Thyacian reprisals are defeated until a Eirindi navy destroys a Thyacian expeditionary force that finally convinces the Thyacian the Eirindi aren't worth it, which also secures Eirindi's reputation as the most feared navy in Mystara. In 728, Thyatis does begin partial settlement of what would become Glantry, even though it was never in any great numbers because of the distance involved. This stops when the Flemish conquer all the new settlers in the area, although a year later they would be defeated by a combined force led by an Alphatian lord who claims the land for Alphatia. 40 years after that, a Thyacian named Alexander Glantry would liberate the land from Alphatia, but it makes that a sovereign nation in its own right instead of returning it to Thyatis. In 827, Al-Khalim of Yalarim forces Alphatia out of Yalarim, and then 3 years later, the last Thyacian colony falls, leaving Thyatis only with their province of Tel Akbir, which remained loyal to the empire over Yalarim. That would be the extent of Thyacian influence in the nation of Yalarim. In 900 AC, Emperor Gabrionis IV decides Thyatis needs to grow and grow quickly, and begins an invasion of the Isle of Dawn, as well as conquering Traladara to the west. 50 years later, Ausland becomes a formal ally of Thyatis, as it's breaking apart from its own separatists. This leads to the second full-blown war with Alphatia, as Thyatis has broken almost every treaty they've signed with the Alphatians. The Spike invasion happens in 960, when Alphatia quickly overruns the Isle of Dawn and makes with haste for Thyatis city. Gabronius V is quickly killed, and Alphatia threatens to sack the capital until the gladiator Thrain Kel Torsen rallies the troops and leads a large contingent of soldiers and gladiators to push back the invasion from Thyatis city. He then declares himself Emperor Thinkal I and purges the military of any officers he considers a threat. He pushes back Alphatia to previous borders and threatens to even more conquest until the Alphatian emperor abdicates and his daughter, Empress Ariadne, takes control and negotiates a peace with Thyatis. That concludes the official timeline. While eventful, it's also leaving a ton of holes in the timeline that can be filled. There's a lot of unexplained bits in the history of Thyatis that comes mostly from the Red Steel sourcebook. That box set mentions a Thyacian province called Ispa that's got a Spanish vibe that appears nowhere in anything previously. There's a massive continuity error all over the place. Nothing in Thyatis is remotely Spanish in theme. Thyatis is Rome, Corinthus is Byzantium, and Hadius is the Holy Roman Empire. If you wanted to make sense of that, make Ispan a former part of Glantry, where the settlers from Thyatis settled, and they were influenced by the Balkadese elves until they moved on because of the various Glantrian politics. Also, how far Thyatis reached is left unclear. Irindi, Traladara, Yalarim, and parts of the Five Shire are confirmed, but considering there's not much stopping them militarily, they could have easily expanded at least partly into Darakan and the northern reaches, even if just for a little bit in their timeline, long before the contraction of the empire today. So little of the actual timeline has been filled, it's hard for a nation based on Rome to justify staying so small for so long. Another point you could fill in is the emperors. There's maybe 10 named emperors in Mystara lore. This isn't a nation that's been around for a millennia, and more importantly is also known for its treachery. Rome, on average, went through an emperor every 8 years. So if you keep to that timeline, you've got 125 emperors. Some might rule for decades, while a large number of them don't make it a year. There's some precedent in this number of emperors with the Irindi book, because it shows that Thyatis names its ships after emperors. And the ships they have listed include emperors like Adriana X, Julian XVII, and Olivia VI. That leaves a lot of emperors to fill in, but it does give you at least 24 to start with. The most recent event that doesn't get hardly any mention in either the Keramikos or the Thyatis Gazetteers is the conquest of Traladara itself, because that doesn't happen very far back on the timeline. It is very possible that some of the longer-lived races took part in that invasion on either side and could tell you about it. You could fill in the parts of the general that led the invasion, or talk about the Traladaran kings that were before that. Or have something about the governors that ruled in the 100 years between the conquest of Traladara and Stefan Keramikos trading his lands to become the sole ruler of it. The future of Thyatis is uncertain, especially with the unpopular nature of Wrath of the Immortals. Thinkal dies, Thyatis becomes a broken shell of itself, and can't fight nations a fraction of its size. In my 1005 timeline, Thinkal still dies, but to treachery rather than the displeasure of immortals. But Thyatis remains the greatest military threat to other nations, though it is still reduced in strength and facing a united alliance to its west, but an equally blooded Alphatia to its east. How you want to deal with Thyatis' future is up to you. It's a bloody long history, but it's one that still has a lot of holes in it. Since Thyatis is a mixture of Rome, Byzantium, and the Holy Roman Empire, the trick was to merge various gladiatorial styles together and update them for Mystara. Took as much as I could from historical examples when creating the gladiator schools, and realized the book didn't need 50 pages of gladiator, so I cut it back down to 8. But first, let's talk about how gladiator contests get started. There's 3 types of people that fight in the arena that the organizers can use, each with different rules and the laws that determine their use. First up is the convicts, which are usually given impossible matches in the expectation of death. Anyone who is sentenced to death in Thyatis can be turned over to the arena as a convict, and you get put in the worst matches possible. You get to fight the monsters, or take part in large-scale bloodbaths that are battle recreations. Only on very rare occasions will a convict impress the emperor in a combat and earn a pardon. The problem is the odds of that happening are low, so when it does happen, the convict becomes a bit of a celebrity among gladiators. Plus, that also requires somebody to be in attendance that can actually pardon you, like the emperor or a local governor, so don't count on it. Next up are the slaves that have volunteered for the arena. Thyacian law has a lot of restrictions on how slaves can be treated, and forbidding them from being sent to the arena without their consent is one of their biggest laws. It does seem like an oxymoron that a slave has to give consent before being turned into a gladiator, but the reason behind the law isn't altruistic. Gladiators have to be trained. Training is expensive. Slaves sent out without training die quickly, and quick deaths bore audiences. So unless the slave is willing to be trained and have a lot of gold spent on him, Thyatis doesn't want him fighting in the arena because that's bad for business. Now, why would a slave want to be a gladiator? Because it's a fast track to freedom. By Thyacian law, all coins thrown into the arena during a match are the property of the winner, and no one else can claim the money. Not the slave's owner, not the organizer of the match, not even the emperor. Since Thyatis allows all slaves to buy their freedom, a slave that fights well can earn quite a bit of coin, and that's if the slave doesn't impress a random noble that will buy the slave's freedom immediately. The last participant is the free citizen, the people that fight as a gladiator because it's their job. Many of the free citizen gladiators are actually former slaves that earned their freedom in the arenas and have decided that they're going to continue being gladiators because there is money to be made. Gladiators can make quite a bit of money fighting in the arena. Apart from the coins thrown to them in the match, gladiators can earn a portion of the gate. They can get appearance fees. They can even earn sponsorships from wealthy citizens. Free gladiators get to choose their matches. While this lets them turn down obvious suicidal matchups, if a gladiator turns down too many difficult matches, they are less likely to be hired in the future. The organizer of the match has quite a bit of paperwork to fill out when scheduling the event, as all events are heavily taxed. The organizer has to hire the stables that will provide the gladiators, plan each match, and schedule who's fighting who. Certain styles are only allowed to fight other certain styles. Men aren't allowed to face women. Different races can't fight each other. Every weapon has to be described, and so on. After the event has been scheduled, every participant is required to parade to the arena from a set staging area for a variety of reasons. First, it's so the crowd can see who's fighting and that raises interest for the event. The regulators in charge of supervising the events also want to see that every gladiator is healthy and ready to fight, and that every gladiator that is scheduled to fight is present, and that there are also no untaxed monsters or similar being used in the events. Gladiators unable to fight to the best of their ability make for bad matches. Bad matches make for unhappy audiences. Unhappy audiences make for violent riots, so all the gladiators have to be ready to fight. The organizer can arrange normally forbidden matches, like between non-traditional pairings of schools or mixing sexes or races in events. The organizer pays what they call as a fine, but it's in reality just another fee for the restrictions to be waived. The fees can be minor, like paying 25 gold pieces to allow a dwarf to fight an orc, all the way to tens of thousands of gold to have the gladiators fight a hydra. Organizers that don't pay their taxes, or stable managers that don't keep their gladiators healthy, or promoters that rig matches can face rather stiff penalties if caught. Emperor Thincall is a former gladiator. He takes a rather dim view on people mistreating his former profession. He has been known to sit in on trials of people violating the gladiatorial code, and even hands out sentences himself, which were always the person being sent to the games as a convict. There's a lot of gladiatorial styles used in Thyatis. All of them reflect on past glories and conquests. This allows former battles and victories to be easily recreated in the arena. The 8 primary schools are Corvus, which represents the Hinterlands, and they fight with a great club. The Flavus style is from Oechalia, and they have a Kusari, and they wear ringmail. Gimmon from the Pearl Islands are famous for the net and trident. Haranama of Yalarum use double scimitars. Iernus from the Isle of Dawn have twin hand axes. The Legio school represents the glory of Thyatis, fighting with a massive shield and longsword. The Mygio school is the newest of the gladiatorial schools, and it was partly inspired by Emperor Thincall himself. It reflects the Alphatian wizards that were defeated after the Spike invasion, and they fight with dual clubs. The last school is the Millenix school. It fights with a spear and shield, and it is modeled after the Millennian Empire of old. All schools are armed the exact same way, and they all wear a similar helmet so the crowds know who is fighting in what style. Very few gladiators actually wear armor. Most schools don't allow anything heavier than leather, if any armor is allowed at all. The crowds are there to see you bleed. Hiding behind armor isn't going to help that. Only the Flavus school actually wears heavy metal armor in the form of a ringmail made out of coins. The armor provides minimal protection while stifling the movement of the gladiator. One of the emperors saw the unarmed Oechalian monks and thought it would be hilarious to put one in heavy armor and make them fight to the death. Some of the Thyacian emperors could be total dicks. You might be wondering why people would volunteer to be gladiators with such a huge chance of death every match. Well, the secret is there's not. Gladiators are expensive investments for the stable managers and the organizers. They aren't there to kill each other, they're there to entertain the crowds. If they fight well, they're going to be given mercy. The only people who show cowardice, flail around, and fight badly, or just fight dirty are going to get the thumbs down when they ask for mercy. Another reason why there's not a lot of death is it's expensive. Gladiators are valuable property and have next of kin, and if they die, then somebody's got to pay their owner or their family for the loss of income. Dying is what the convicts are there for. They sate the crowd's bloodlust, and the actual gladiators do the quality fighting for the crowd. Not saying death is impossible, but the powers that be do their best to keep the actual fighters alive. There's a few special type of gladiators that don't normally fight other gladiators. First and foremost, there's the Venators, the gladiators that fight beasts one-on-one. They're typically armed differently for each creature, and they get paid handsomely for it. It takes a different kind of skill to fight an owlbear than it does to fight a berserker. Intelligent monsters don't fight Venators normally. Instead, they fight against the regular gladiators, and of course that all requires a special permit with a special tax. The lesser gladiator to the Venator is the Bestiari. These gladiators fight against monsters or creatures in a group. These gladiators are actually trying to be Venators, but they're not good enough, or the crowds prefer mass battles, so that's why they have to fight in groups. They tend to fight truly large creatures like elephants or dinosaurs or dragoons. They also have a higher fatality rate than other gladiators. Their skills aren't as honed as a Venator normally. And giant spiders don't really understand the concept of thumbs up. The last of the three quasi-gladiators, the Paganiarius, well, that was the Latin term for them. These are the equivalent of circus clowns in the gladiatorial matches. They keep the crowds entertained between games, often fighting with comical weapons like pillows or feather dusters. They're awfully hen, much to the displeasure of the hen who hate being treated like children. They actually aren't in any danger. In fact, for some events they're hired to fight the children of various nobles. They do make a good living, but they are gladiators the same way that stage fighters are actual warriors. Behind the scenes, gladiators find their lives be equal parts Spartan and luxurious. They have to train. It's what they do when they're not fighting normally. But they're given the best medical care, and many stable managers make healthy donations to the various temples to provide healing for gladiators after the match. The Temple of Vanya is known to have its own stable of gladiators to further glorify the immortal. Gladiators eat well. Malnourished gladiators bring down the wrath of the emperor. They might live in gilded cages before being thrown into combat, but they do live well in those cages until it's time to fight. That draws this week's video to a glorious victory. There are a ton of adventures available for gladiators, be it players that used to be gladiators that are now adventurers, players that are turned into gladiators against their will, or you can organize events to make money if you have a domain in Thyatis. The module Arena of Thyatis is built entirely around the concept of players being shanghaied into gladiatorial combat. Plus, find somebody who doesn't want to fight a vampire with just a net and a trident. The city was founded in 600 BC from the refugees fleeing the Millennian Empire on the continent of Skjoldvord. Refugees came from 3 tribes and settled in 3 regions, with the Thyacians settling at the delta of the Masonian River and Devanya's Cradle, a strait between the mainland and the island of Hadius. The city was founded on Emperor's Hill, the highest point in the city now. It is built on some of the most fertile soil in the region, and as such is surrounded by large plantations just outside the gates. The city is a crowded metropolis. The streets are packed at all hours of the day, and several shops and services are open 24 hours. Unlike most cities, Thyatis contains races of all sorts, though non-human races are clearly in the minority here. People not just from all over the Empire call Thyatis home, but it has large populations of expats from numerous nations as well. The common tongue is derived from Thyacian, though it's not as expansive as actual Thyacian is. While you can get across simple concepts with the common language, it is the equivalent of a child's education compared to actually knowing the language. Speaking the common tongue in Thyatis marks you as an outsider, which causes the same problems as everybody who refers to the city incorrectly. Thyatis is divided into 10 districts: Emperor's Hill, the Heart, the Government District, the Blocks, Merchant Row, the Estates, Axetown, the Zendralium, and the Greater and Lesser Harbors. The city is known for its aqueducts, bringing in fresh water from the northern hills. The Masonian River is too muddy and polluted due to river traffic and runoff to serve as a fresh water source. The aqueducts service all portions of the city, but the dense populations of the Blocks and Axetown means the water supply there is strained to the limit. Emperor's Hill is obviously home to Emperor Thenkal, but it's also home to the wealthy elite of the city. The palace was built 1,000 years ago, though it has been renovated and reinforced numerous times, mainly due to earthquakes. The palace is one of the most elaborate and beautiful buildings in Thyatis, as well as one of the most secure. It is heavily defended against air attack because of the threat of the Alphatians. The district isn't highly populated because of the sheer cost of the mansions, as they can range in the millions of gold pieces. Because of the presence of the Emperor and the wealth of the people living here, if you don't appear to belong in Emperor's Hill, you will be removed by the large guard presence. The heart is the most important part of the city as far as the citizenry is concerned. Here is where the public works and the entertainments lie. Nobles and commoners stand shoulder to shoulder to see the next great wonder that is being built for their enjoyment. The Colosseum towers over the district, where tens of thousands of people visit every week for a new show. Private clubs dot the district, featuring all sorts of exclusive entertainment from the mundane to the perverse. The Imperial Library contains the largest collection of historical and biographical books in the world. The Collegium Arcanum is a college devoted to producing wizards. It's laughably small compared to Gladiators or Alphatia, but it still provides an excellent education for would-be wizards. The poor can visit the imperial bakeries to acquire free loaves of panem, the type of bread made daily to feed the masses. The government district is locally known by its nickname, the Machine. Here's where the bureaucrats actually run the day-to-day operations of the entire empire. The district includes the Senate, where 300 senators argue over the newest laws of the land. It's actually a popular tourist spot, housing over 1,000 spectators in the balconies. The district also contains buildings for the various ministries, such as trade, war, foreign service, and so on. It also includes all the embassies located in Thyatis. However, the individual ambassadors live in their own private residences, as the quarters provided are quite cramped. The blocks are one of the most populous districts, where the majority of the regular citizens live in 3-story tall tenements. While cramped, it isn't run down, as the people here take pride in their neighborhood. It's not a slum. People are upbeat, crime is managed, and waste is mostly disposed of. It's just a very tightly packed neighborhood. The tenement buildings often take up entire blocks, with small shops scattered through them for necessities. It's a good place to disappear in if you need to lay low, but it's safe enough so that you can go out in public without being stabbed. The estates are one of the higher-end neighborhoods. Nobles who can't afford to live like the hyper-rich do on Emperor's Hill have homes in the estates. The High Temple of Vanya dominates the district, with its tower reaching a staggering 10 stories tall. Several other temples are located here, as well as numerous martial orders, like the Storm Soldiers, Sisterhood of the Sword, and the Brotherhood of the Grey Lady. During the day, the district is teeming with visitors, especially for the numerous churches found within. At night, however, the district closes down, and visitors are asked to come back tomorrow. Axetown is the slums of Thyatis. Originally, it was meant to be torn down. It would have been rebuilt, but the Shadow Hand, the Thieves Guild, paid a lot of people a lot of money to keep it as is. Now it is a run-down, overbuilt shantytown filled with brothels, gambling houses, and drug dens. Anything can be purchased in Axetown, from stolen goods to dangerous magic items to illegal slaves. The city guard doesn't patrol in Axetown. It is owned and operated by the Shadow Hand. As long as the violence and blatant crime doesn't spill over into the other districts, the thieves are left to police their own. The Zendrolium is the military headquarters of Thyatis. This is the home of Fort Zendrolium, where a full 6 cohorts of the 1st Legion are garrisoned. Along with the normal forces, there is also a company from the Retebius Air Fleet that stands guard, including 5 dragons. Aside from the large military presence, the district is home to Blackrock Prison, one of the worst places in Thyatis to be. It's not a military prison, it's where the worst convicts are left to die, or until they are dragged off to the Colosseum to be fed to all sorts of nasty beasts. The harbors of Thyatis are largely quiet and boring compared to the rest of the city. The greater harbor is the civilian harbor and contains numerous warehouses and shipping companies. It has a small number of merchants for both sailors and people wanting to get early deals, but most of the cargoes are quickly offloaded and moved into the city proper. The lesser harbor is primarily for military use, and as such is off-limits to civilians without authorization. The lesser harbor also contains the shipbuilding yards, and various vessels are under construction at all hours. There is a strong military presence, as you can imagine, because of the strategic value of the district, as well as the naval ships. This is one place you don't want to be caught without permission. The last district is Merchant Row, sandwiched between the heart and the harbors. Here is where everything imaginable is for sale, with the exception of magic and monsters. Slaves are openly auctioned. Food and drink from across the empire can be found in the stalls of numerous merchants. If your party is returning from a tough adventure, and you are also bringing back an entire set of rather nice furniture you just couldn't leave behind because that couch was the perfect size for your castle, this is where you will find the matching love seat. Everything sold here is above board. There's not much that's illegal to own or sell in Thyatis, and for the few rare things that are, that's when you need to head to Axetown. Thyatis is known for its constant entertainments, as a bored population is a dangerous population. From chariot races to gladiator games to plays and festivals, there's always something to watch in Thyatis. Free bread is handed out at these festivals so the citizens won't starve, even when the economy is weak. Bards are in constant demand. And in the villas of the nobles, they are often showered with gold if they perform well. And if they don't, well, accidents are common at these galas. Popular shows involve the more exotic citizens of the empire, such as Pearl Islanders or Ochilians. Even the mere presence of rare races will draw a crowd of onlookers. This can be a blessing or a bane, depending on whether you are an attention-loving Shi or a misanthropic Nagpa. The streets are broad and well-paved. The Thyacians do love their roads, after all. Chariots, wagons, and palanquins constantly travel down in comfort, while the commoners and slaves traverse the sidewalks. There is a large slave population that will keep the city tidy, except of course for Axe Town and occasionally the blocks. Graffiti is a major problem, as politicians will pay hooligans to disparage their rivals in the form of obscene slogans painted on walls or even defacing the statues of their enemies. Art is everywhere in the city, as well as advertisements posted on almost every available flat surface. The closer you get to Emperor's Hill or the estates, the less you see of the graffiti or advertisements, but a few brave souls will make the attempt to draw attention to their cause or business. The diversity of the population can come as a shock to foreign visitors. Compared to the mostly homogeneous lands of Yalarum or Darachin, in Thyatis you'll see olive-skinned Thyacians standing next to dark-skinned Nuari, pale Hadians, ruddy Hinterlanders, and golden-skinned Ochilians. Bialian elves even have their own enclave inside the city, known as the Park, where they are allowed to sleep in an artificial forest under a night sky. Dwarves come to sell their wares to the nobles that appreciate quality, and gnomes have a constant market among the upper class for their mechanical marvels. Unlike other places, it is not considered rude to stare in Thyatis. In fact, more exotic creatures visiting will often hire bodyguards to keep the throngs of gawkers from harassing them. Thyatis is a hive of urban adventures. It's based on Rome, after all. The murderous nature of the senators and the lesser politicians means there's always work for someone of a sinister bent. The tightly packed nature of the city means fire is a constant threat, and of course crime is always common in large cities like this. Players can join in on the Gladiator games, prevent monsters from escaping, and Axe Town is filled with all sorts of bad people looking to do harm on others. And if the party happens to save Emperor Thinkal's life from an assassination attempt, he is going to be all sorts of grateful. Homicidal, rage-filled, and vengeance-driven, but grateful at the same time. Thus concludes this trip to Thyatis. It's unique among the cities because it is naturally large, not because of magical help. These are everyday people, not wizards reshaping the countryside. That doesn't make it any less dangerous than Glantry City. Before we get started, I got in the mail some dice from Paladin Roleplaying as a thank you for this channel. I didn't ask for them, they were sent as gifts. Not bad dice, I only got to roll them once before the wife and daughter claimed them as their own. They thought the colors were pretty, and the dice did have some weight to them. They're not the cheap plastic type. They aren't heavy enough to leave dents in the table, like some types of dice, so your Dungeon Master isn't going to ban them from the table. And I won't lie, the D20 did crit hit on the one and only time I got to roll it before it disappeared into the wife's dice bag. I'll attach a link to the description if you're interested. For those unfamiliar with the term, agnomen, or victory title/name, was an honor Rome gave out to generals who led their armies in the defeat or conquest of a particular foe or region. In 202 BC, Scipio defeated Hannibal in what is now Tunisia by adapting his tactics to counter the elephants and using his cavalry to envelop the enemy to a devastating effect. Scipio received a triumph upon his return and was given the agnomen of Africanus, or Champion of Africa. It wasn't a nickname like Stonewall Jackson or Bull Halsey. They literally gave him a legal new last name as a reward. If that were a thing today, I would probably be called Eldarius for my defeat of 8 straight Eldar armies back at Games Day with my Attilan Armored Company. I know Eldar were the dominant army at the time, but 8 of them? Nothing else? And they're all just variants of each other? It wasn't even a challenge by the 4th battle. They were facing Imperial Guard for the first time. I was facing a carbon copy of the last army I just stomped into the ground. Wash, rinse, repeat. Even when the judge placed a giant wall across the entire table in the last battle, that was declared impassable to tanks and horses, but Eldar were not affected. Yeah, I still remember that bit of favoritism, Chris, 30 years later. But you forgot they were Imperial tanks shooting at Eldar scum, and I had more guns than the other guy had filthy Xenos. Where was I? Oh yeah, Thyatis. The extent of Thyacian expansion has never been fully explained. In canon, they've conquered what is now Keramikos, Yalarum, Irindi, parts of northern Devania, Norwald, half of the Isle of Dawn, sections of Glantry, and large parts of the Savage Coast. That leaves huge chunks of land that their presence was never mentioned, but they had to have some force there that invaded. You aren't getting to Glantry without passing through Darachin, but Darachin never mentions Thyacian occupation. Minrathad hints at possible occupation by Thyatis at one point, but nothing solid is ever given. The Five Shires also talk about Thyacian occupation, but that was never a formal conquest. There's other battles that weren't conquests that the Thyacians were proud of, even if they didn't lead to the expansion of the empire. Now that I've further muddied the waters, here's a bunch of family names to attach to NPCs and where those names came from. The most prestigious name you can have in Thyatis is Alphatius. That means in your history, a relative was part of the rebellion that drove Alphatia out in 2 BC, or in the Spike invasion of Thyatis in 960 AC. Thencal Taurian's full name after his defeat of Alphatian forces became Emperor Thencal Taurian Alphatius, a name that is also applied to his children. The victory name is only used in formal introductions, as some generals have won multiple battles and would have numerous names awarded. It's rarely used outside the nation, especially in nations whose defeat is honored by the name. No herald in Alphatia is going to announce the full name of Astralia Taurian Alpharius at court, no matter how much favor she has with Empress Ariadne. A victory name is never given by the emperor. It has to be given by the Senate alone, and after much debate. Even Thencal's title was not unanimously given, despite him saving the empire. 2 of the oldest victory names in Thyatis is that of Ochilius and Nuarius. Ochilia and the Pearl Islands, which are occupied by the Nuari. Originally, these were 2 kingdoms that were conquered alongside Thyatis by Alphatia, and fought against their oppressors for freedom. But they were betrayed at the end. When they won their freedom, their kings were assassinated along with Emperor Licinius. Troops were then sent by the new Emperor Zendralion, who conquered both islands in short order. The emperor used his new power to reward the generals of the conquest with their titles. Though this ability was again reserved for the Senate, Zendralion had just assassinated almost all of his political enemies in a single day. The senators that were left were not going to oppose him. Of the families, the Ochilius family thrived and can still be found on Thyatis, as well as the island of Ochilia. Over the centuries, that province has become loyal to Thyatis and holds the name of Ochilius with some regard. The descendants of the original general have interbred with the Ochilians and has helped assimilate the island into the empire after all these years. Of the numerous governors that have ruled over Ochilia, approximately half of them have been descendants of the original Ochilius. But the island's social structure is still in place. A woman with the name of Ochilius might be held in high esteem, but she still won't be allowed out of her caste under any circumstance. This, of course, leads many to leave for the homeland like so many other Ochilian women. The general awarded with the title Nuarius was known for being a brutal man, one who put down rebellions without mercy. As a reward for his tactics, in the Alphatian Rebellion and the conquest of the Pearl Islands, he was made the first governor of the tropical islands. There the name of Nuarius died out. Governor Nuarius ruled with an iron fist, but found the tactic to be unneeded. Pearl Islanders had few warriors. They could offer no resistance to the governor even if they wanted to. If they were left alone, they would just fish and farm like they always had. The governor sent his children back to Thyatis proper as politicians, but they were claimed by his lethal politics. Eventually the name died out. It's remembered today only as the first governor of the island. The most controversial victory name in Thyatis is that of Hatiarius. The Hatius revolt in 313 AC was crushed by Alexian II, forever after known as Alexian Hatarius. This title was bestowed on numerous generals that won key battles across the land as well. The fighting was brutal, as the Hatians were some of the best warriors Thyatis had at the time of their revolt. The punishment that Hatius received after their defeat is still reflected centuries later, such as their lack of city walls. The name of Hatiarius is commonplace now, since it was given to over a dozen generals in the defeat of the rebellion. The storm soldiers of Hatius despise anyone with the name, as a reminder of their greatest defeat, and have targeted people with the name with abuse and even murder. The name, however, is a powerful one, with numerous senators and influential members of society proudly claiming ancestry to the victors of the Hatius rebellion. Tralodarius is one of the most recent victory names given for the glory of the empire, after the conquest of Traladaria in 900 AC. It was a swift and decisive invasion, as the Traladarians were a fractious people who could offer little in the way of resistance. General Tralodarius returned after the conflict with little interest in ruling a land that was largely untamed and would require decades of work to be profitable. The name was held in some regard back in Thyatis, but with the nation being given to Stephen Karamikos to be run as an autonomous region of Thyatis, it doesn't hold the same prestige it once does. Of note, Stephen Karamikos is not keeping with the custom of victory names, partially to appease his new citizens. The most common victory name in Thyatis is that of Eularius. The empire famously conquered their desert neighbor to the north and spent centuries defending it against rebellions, the Alphatian invasion, and organized internal threats like the Sisthic. There have been hundreds of battles in Yalarm against a myriad of foes. Because of this victory name has been awarded dozens of times. Even with the eventual defeat of Thyatis by the forces of Al-Khalim in 828 AC, the name remains a prestigious one, especially in the province of Tel Akbir, who sided with Thyatis over Al-Khalim. The name is an established one, since the initial invasion happened over 700 years ago, but the most recent names were awarded approximately 200 years ago. The older the family that uses the name is held in higher regard, but even the most recent recipient of the name has a substantial pull in Thyacian elite society. The name Irindius is a cursed name in Thyacian society because of the defeat that is associated with it. The ill-fated Thyacian invasion of Irindi in 571 AC conquered the island nation and established several penal colonies. The name Irindius was given in celebration of the victory, though the occupation only lasted 29 years before the native population and the prisoners rose up and drove the Thyacians from the islands. Multiple attempts to retake the island were repulsed by the superior Irindi fleets, backed up with the support of the Honor Island fire mages. Finally, in 713 AC, the Thyacian navy under Admiral Irindius was utterly crushed by the Irindi fleet and the first appearance of the fire ships. The family name died at the Fifth Battle of Honor Island, and is held today as a lesson in poor leadership in both the occupation and the battles afterwards. Ravinius is the most recent name awarded by the Thyacian Senate, celebrating the defeat and complete surrender of the Raven tribe in the hinterlands of Devania. The proposed conquest of the hinterlands was a controversial decision by Emperor Thencal, as many viewed it as a waste of resources, considering the conflicts of the Isle of Dawn and Alphasia's encroachment on Norwald. But the initial battle between the Raven tribe and the 28th Thyacian Legion of Ochalia led to the devastating rout of the Hinterlanders and the subsequent surrender of the entire tribe to Thyatis. This confirmed Thencal's decision, and his supporters pushed the awarding of the victory name through the Senate. While the battles in the Hinterlands are still ongoing, it was a much-needed morale booster for the Empire. The Isle of Dawn is a common source for various victory names because of the continuing conflicts that have persisted since the founding of the Empire. They're also the least prestigious because of the number of them, and the fact that the island has been a constant stalemate for centuries now. Names like Thothius, Triskelius, and Dunius reflect on battles long since forgotten by the common folk due to centuries of battle that have done little to complete the conquest. Many of the minor nobles on the island possess victory names, but since the battles are lost to the centuries, few can even remember the name of the descendant that gave them the honorarium. Victory names are not something you're going to encounter in a campaign very often at all. They are flavor for the setting, pure and simple. Still, if you want the party to encounter a particularly powerful Thyacian senator or military leader, you can always mention their last name as Alphasius or Ravinius. If the character is Thyacian, there's a chance that if they can lead a Thyacian army to great victory, they might even earn a victory name of their own. While not quite as useful as a magic sword or a relic, there's still something awesome in winning a victory so vital to a nation that they give you an extra last name as a reward. The Duchy of Retebius is one of the smaller regions in Thyatis, with a population of just over 200,000, located in the furthest point west in the Gulf of Cantrium. It is mostly large plains, with only a single large city in Retebius. Most of the land is used exclusively for farming. It does have one of the largest ranches in Thyatis, devoted to growing cattle, both for regular consumption as well as feeding the mounts of the Air Fleet. The population is typical Thyacian, but most are concerned more with the growing of crops and livestock than the politics their nation is known for. One major difference between Retebians and their countrymen is the Retebians aren't fazed by the appearance of dragons flying overhead. The Retebius Air Corps was formed during the first days of the Thyacian Empire, when Emperor Zendralian realized the need for a means to counter Alphasia's aerial superiority during the Revolution. At the start of the revolt, the Alphasian cleric Retebius turned on his former empire, and with the use of his white dragon mount, he used it to great effect against their airships. After the war, the Air Corps was formed from veteran soldiers trained in the use of flying creatures. The Emperor also organized the Knights of the Air, a semi-private group made of adventurers with flying mounts and magical items sworn to defend the Empire. The Order of the White Drake was created in appreciation of Retebius' contribution to the Revolution, though their fate was sadly to become scapegoats for the shortcomings of the Thyacian military during the Alphasian Spike invasion. The Air Fleet was created in 571 AC, when the need for a larger force of aerial troops was realized. The Air Fleet's first action was to help repulse a Minrathadian incursion into the Grand Duchy of Taruntius during one of the Empire's periods of upheaval over some political turmoil or another. The Air Fleet wasn't the primary reason for the victory over Minrathad, but it proved its worth during the battle. After the cause of the internal turmoil was settled, the Air Fleet was expanded again, and the Retebius Air Academy was ordered to allow for training and raising of aerial creatures. The Air Fleet is officially attached to the 18th Legion, and is assigned to guard the city of Retebius rather than being deployed abroad like many of the other legions from the homeland. The Air Fleet itself comprises the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd cohorts of the Legion, comprised of 1,500 troops out of the 5,000. The rest of the troops in the 18th Legion are typically used for guarding the duchy itself, but a large percentage are support personnel that serve to build and maintain the expanding grounds of the Air College. At least 2 cohorts are devoted to providing full-time security to the college, outside of the protection afforded by having the Air Fleet stationed there in the first place. At any given time, there will be only one corps of the actual air fleet present at the Air College, with the other two corps being seconded to other legions as normal with the Thyacian military structure. In case of an actual war, the entire legion will be deployed to the field as needed, with guard duty being taken up either by legions normally held in reserve or auxiliaries raised specifically for that purpose. The 10th cohort is used for care and raising of the various monsters found at the Air College, and will typically never leave their normal assignment under any circumstances. However, sending them out as an entire corps is not a hard and fast rule. Thyacian military doctrine allows for the temporary assignment of units as small as a squad. If another group needs aerial support, an element from the Retebius Air Fleet will be made available to them. Signing up for the Air Fleet has several requirements. First, the character has to be at least 5th level in terms of game rules. They will then sign up for a term of 6 years and will be trained as both a soldier and in riding flying creatures. While the fleet prefers new recruits to train, it will accept exceptional troops transferring in from other cavalry units. Because of this, Corindus is heavily overrepresented in terms of percentage of troops in the air fleet. Recruits will be paid for their time and will be eventually promoted to the rank of officer during their term. There is a bit of prestige involved with being a member of the air fleet, giving the recruiters more candidates than necessary, allowing for a higher quality of recruits. The role of the air fleet has expanded in both its duties and uses over the centuries. Now numbering over 1,000, they've been used across the Empire for both military and relief efforts. Air fleet dragons have routed the tribes of the Hinterlands and Devania. On the Isle of Dawn, Alphatian airships in the unclaimed areas have been intercepted by griffin riders on numerous occasions. The air fleet is often used as reconnaissance to find bandit camps, as well as cutting off retreating humanoid raids. Larger creatures will often be used to carry supplies to settlements threatened by natural disasters, or troops cut off by enemy attacks. The mounts come from a variety of sources, from intelligent creatures to creatures sired from eggs or newborns. Intelligent creatures include a variety of dragons or sphinxes that are often hired for their service in the air fleet. Non-intelligent creatures include griffins, hippogriffs, pegasi, and rocs. These are usually raised from birth or captured when very young for exclusive use in the air fleet. The fleet will also make use of drolums, the dragon golems of legend. This can prove to be problematic because their very existence is hated by dragons, causing them to be attacked on sight. Because of this, the few drolums in the air fleet are kept far away from any unit with a dragon in it. The air fleet also makes heavy use of all available magical items that allow for flight, including brooms and carpets as well as spells. Anytime one of these magic items is captured by Thyacian forces, they will be immediately sent to the Air Academy for repurposing into service. Artifact-level magic items are not sent to the air fleet because their power level will often endanger the rider and anyone close. A large number of wizards in the fleet use their spells to provide their flight abilities, freeing up creatures or objects for non-spellcasters. While Thyatis does not have the magical resources that Alphatia possesses, it does have several airships and similar that were either captured in combat or seized from Thyacian citizens for tax reasons. The half a dozen airships controlled by the air fleet are used for intercepting other airships or large flying creatures, or more commonly serve as mobile command headquarters for other legions that they're seconded to. There are several magic tech devices purchased from the Supreme Symposium of Gnomish Syndicates. These devices are only used in dire emergencies or for very specific purposes that they were designed to handle. They are far too expensive to be risked for mundane tasks, and usage of them requires permission from the legate of the 18th Legion. 75% of the air fleet is comprised of pegasi and hippogriffs. As can be expected, they are the core of the force, serving exactly as war horses of earthbound forces. Against non-flying opponents, they will circle around to engage enemy forces from the rear, trying to take out leadership when possible. When dealing with aerial opponents, they will try and strike from multiple directions at once to confuse the enemy, as well as preventing them from retaliating with an efficient method. Griffins and sphinxes make up 20% of the air fleet's mounts, and are ridden by specialists or veteran soldiers. I know the book says first come, first serve when it comes to acquiring mounts, but you're not giving your best mounts to the new guy when there are people with years of experience available and waiting. The sphinxes are also used as advanced scouts, especially with their sentience, magic, and ability to follow orders. The most competent of riders will often take on 2 tasks at the same time, one for the rider to handle on foot, and another for the sphinx to deal with using its native abilities. The last 5% of the air fleet are made up of the most powerful creatures available, that being dragons, drolums, and rocs. The dragons that make up this part of the fleet are mostly white, blue, and gold, with whites making up half of all dragons present. There are other dragons that are a part of the air fleet, but they number less than 1%, often being found in single digits. Dragons are rarely part of the air fleet by force. Either they volunteer, are directly hired, or have a long tradition of being part of the air fleet. Most white dragons were once part of the Order of the White Drake until they were forcibly disbanded by Emperor Thincall because of their sluggish response to the Spike invasion. Metallic dragons other than gold are welcomed into the air fleet, but they are so few in number that this has only happened a handful of times. Chromatic and gem dragons looking for treasure will hire on for a limited time in exchange for a hefty sum, leaving once their contract expires. For chromatics outside of blue dragons, this is frowned upon, while gem dragons don't care where the gold is coming from. Ruby, sapphire, onyx, and black dragons are the most common dragons found in the air fleet as mercenaries. Finding new creatures that can be trained or used by the air fleet can be a highly profitable venture, assuming you can get the creatures back to Thyatis alive, and if they're actually trainable. Getting a manticore or a dragon back alive might be possible, but getting them to bear a rider instead of killing him is another matter. Pterodactyls from the Isle of Dread might be trained, but normally can't carry the full weight of an armored knight. Because of these limitations, creatures like thunderheads and skyworms aren't considered viable. Giant flying animals are an option, but the distance involved in returning one is problematic. Considering it takes years for an animal to be trained enough to see if it can take a rider, most monster hunters prefer to stick with the creatures already used by the air fleet. The air fleet has developed several items to deal with the hazards of flying, from adding pads to the armor to help with cold temperatures at higher altitudes, to specialist saddles to prevent riders from accidentally falling. The two most famous bits of equipment are the bumbershoot and the breathing gear. The bumbershoot is a large umbrella and parachute hybrid. It acts like a featherfall spell. When the rider is dismounted, they open the chute and land safely about 95% of the time. Breathing gear is a mask with a pair of goggles connected to a nozzle that provides magically created air, useful for riding creatures that can fly high enough that lack of oxygen becomes a problem. The support staff for the air fleet is highly specialized because of the unique needs for the unit. Where Legionnaires might have to dig ditches in the 13th Legion and the Hinterlands for busy work, the 18th Legionnaires have to break out large brushes to give the dragons warm soapy baths whenever they demand. Mess officers have to know how to carve up horse meat for the griffins as much as they have to cook potatoes for the regular troops. A large number of the Legion are animal handlers, and a single rider can have up to a dozen assistants for each animal. Larger creatures like rocks or dragons might have their own retinue, often hand-picked by the dragons to deal with their larger size. Entire herds of cattle are slaughtered every year to feed the animals, one of the reasons why Retebius was chosen to house the air fleet because of its large ranches. The air fleet will often have flying support in the form of winged humanoids when they can find them, especially in the form of the living statues known as winged warriors. Summoned elemental creatures of air will also supplement the forces of the air fleet, often cast by wizards serving alongside the mounted troops. To start with, none of this video is canon outside the recap on the lore. Everything else is me holding down all the maps, source books, and gazetteers I can find, and beating them until a coherent bit of lore comes out. Ispa was made up explicitly for the Savage Coast, and the people there are based heavily on the Spanish or Portuguese peoples, and the lands they colonized in the Savage Coast. The obvious problem is Thyatis is based on Rome, Byzantium, and Germany. There's no Ispa on the maps of Thyatis, never has been. There's no trace of anything remotely Spanish-related in Thyatis at all, not in any of the names, the cities, or even in the culture, and that's the crux of the matter. What is canon is that 1500 years ago the Red Curse started in the Savage Baronies, and during the Week Without Magic it spread uncontrollably to the other regions. Depending on what books you were reading, and by books I mean between the Player's Guide and the DM's Guide and the Red Steel box set, where the Red Curse ranged before and after the spread is never fully explained, and the sources inside the setting books only make things more confusing. For this video, I'm going with the Red Curse was originally only over part of the baronies, and the curse spread it through most of the baronies, leaving the surrounding areas only slightly affected. That is the least headache-inducing option out of several headache-inducing options. The Ispans showed up about 100 years ago on the Savage Coast, being forcibly settled there by the Thyacians. Despite sharing the Spanish vibe with the Bel Cadiz elves, there's no connection. The elves came from Devania, and while the Ispans were apparently in Thyatis the entire time. I've tried to connect the two cultures together in a single timeline, and it just doesn't. The dates of the arrival and the source of their origins cannot be combined into any coherent story and keep the explanation even remotely plausible. If this sounds like I'm having to explain a lot before moving on to the beef of the subject, it's because this is everything I've had to sort through to figure out just how badly Red Steel was written. That being said, we know when the Ispans arrived. We know they were sent by Emperor Gabrionis IV in the second year of his reign. The lands they were sent to settle were known to be cursed, but the curse was obvious with the red sand and the cursed creatures. They learned to stay out of those areas, and everything was good, at least until the curse spread. But that still doesn't tell us where they came from and why that land is no longer there. It's time to consult the maps and figure out a good place where to locate the original Ispa. 3 regions came to mind looking at the map: Devania, the Isle of Dawn, and the Imperial Territories and future dominions of the original Thyacian map from the Dawn of the Emperors. At first, Devania was the obvious choice, because then I can explain the link between the Ispans and the Bel Cadiz. But Thyatis didn't return to the continent of their origin until after the Ispan relocation to the Savage Coast, and didn't fully begin invading and conquering Devania until decades later. That pretty much eliminated Devania as a source of the Ispans. Then we move on to the Isle of Dawn, with its large amount of emptiness all around. This one becomes tricky, because you're trying to match the Spanish climate with the Thyacian colonies there, and they're based heavily around North England and Scotland. Spain's climate is all over the place, and you're not going to find a lot of moors and highlands around Madrid. The one desert in the Isle of Dawn is in Thyatis, which is more like Egypt, rather than the Tabernus Desert in South Spain, which means you are more likely to be bitten by an asp than shot by Lee Van Cleef in Thyatis. It's also deep in the Alphatian side of the island. There's not an adjacent Thyacian territory to grab the appropriate land, so Isle of Dawn is a poor match as well. Then we have the Thyacian territories, located directly north of the town of Hillfork, between the regions of Burhor and Halathius. Even better, the northern part of the territories are mountains, whose average height match those of Spain. To the north you will find Yalarum, which is important to setting up one of the savage baronies. So we've got the right climate, the right location, and an unnamed and unexplored region deep inside of Thyatis. Madre los Dios, I think we found Ispa. Now that we've got a region to set them in, we have to come up with a reason why they were there and why they left. Why they were there is easy. The Ispan people were the original occupants of what would become Thyatis. They were all happy and go-lucky over 1,000 years ago until the three tribes appeared over the ocean. The Ispans tried to hold them back, but the Thyacians were just better at waging war. The Ispans were pushed back from the coasts, through the forests, finally into the hill countries, where the terrain favored them, and they were able to finally hold their own. The Duchy of Ispa was founded when the Thyacians and Ispans made peace, and they were largely left to their own devices after that. Over the years, the Ispans spread out over their territory, but due to the hilly and mountainous terrain, they tended to become quite isolated even from each other. Numerous subcultures emerged based on geography. The Ispans that would later settle Saragon lived adjacent to the Yalari border and adopted many of their customs. The highest settled areas became known for their unique culture and their focus on ranching, and they later became the people of Guadalante. The trading cities that lay on the borders of Ispa were populated by the future Texiarius and Gargona populations. You can put any of the savage barony people into a region of Ispa with little effort, with just a few exceptions, but those can be explained away in the time since resettlement. Now that we've got Ispa established, we've got to get rid of them. How do you get a large number of people out of a region willingly? I know what you're thinking, but faking a nuclear reactor leak on board a Soviet submarine has been done before. Alright, time for a deep dive. And I know how much you love deep dives, because every time I have to dig up something mentioned once in a product that no one has, can find, or can afford, the crowd goes wild. On the Eastern Nations trail map, there is a list of diseases, and the one specific to the Altan Tepes Mountains, the very mountains that Ispa was founded on or around, is bugbear typhus. This is a nasty illness to catch, with a high infection rate and a serious hit to your constitution. It's fatal inside of a week, but worse, it drives the infected into a state of rage that causes them to attack others in a berserk fit. It's pretty much the virus from 28 Days Later, the rather confusing sequel to Sandra Bullock's dramedy, 28 Days. 100 years ago, a rather virulent strain of bugbear typhus absolutely ravaged Ispa. Entire towns were wiped out. The virus kept spreading out of control. The government of Ispa collapsed. The death toll was well over 50% before word even got to the emperor about what was happening. A single legion was dispatched to figure out what was going on, and that ballooned into half a dozen legions when they found themselves attacked by hordes of rage-filled Spaniards. Which is something the guys based on the Italians could understand, just not from the Spaniards. The dead and the slain were stacked like cordwood and burned in place. Ispa was declared a lost cause by the military commander. Emperor Gabronius had a major choice to make. The other regions were not going to let the thousands of Ispan survivors into their area because of the threat of contamination. He couldn't send them back, because there was very little left of Ispa. The legion commanders were burning towns and slaughtering all the livestock as a preventative measure. You couldn't get the Ispans to return to their homes regardless. The memories of the plague and the resulting slaughter were recent memories. The emperor consulted his most trusted advisors, as the Ispans were quarantined into impromptu camps just inside their borders. After much discussion, one of the imperial cartographers proposed settling the survivors on the savage coast. Not much was known about the specific region. The maps that did exist were woefully outdated and made no mention of the Red Curse or the surrounding nations. As far as they knew it, it was uninhabited. Regardless, any yokels they might find in this new arm of Thyatis would not be able to stand up to the might of the Thyacian legions. The Ispans were taken downriver to a waiting fleet of merchant ships outside of Thyatis city for the journey to the new home. The relocation was not optional. No other domain in Thyatis would take them, and all of Ispa was burning on the orders of the emperor, so there was no going back regardless. The fleet taking them to the Red Coast was old. Nobody wanted to waste good ships on a one-way trip. The refugees had the reputation of being plague carriers, even though the sickness had largely burned itself out. Even the ships sent to escort them maintained a healthy distance. The sailors that crewed the ships were made up of mainly condemned slaves who were given a chance at forgiveness, or naval crew deemed expendable. More than one ship foundered or broke up and sank with all souls, as no one dared stop and rescue what they thought were dead men anyways. The fleet was escorted through Minrathad and Irindi waters by their respective fleets. and finally left unaided once they passed Etrugan. The Ispans landed first at what would become Villaverde, with the ships moving further along the coast until all the passengers had been unloaded. The Ispan people were then moved further inland until the land was thoroughly settled. Only then did they discover the curse and all the horrible things that came with it. The Ispans just can't catch a break. As far as old Ispa goes, nothing remains. While the epidemic burned itself out in a matter of months, Thyatis was not taking that chance. Every town was leveled. Only the most stubborn and, more importantly, the most remote settlements remained. The legions were quite meticulous in wiping out all aspects of Ispa. Anyone who even looked like they were infected were immediately killed. All that remained of the province once the legions had left were burned out buildings, torn down walls, and smoking corpses. Gabronius IV did know how to get things done in his early years. As the decades went by and the region showed no signs of infection that had devastated the population, it was slowly reopened up for resettlement. It is still considered a cursed region, believed to be filled with not just disease, but undead and angry spirits from all the death and destruction. Emperor Thencall reorganized the territory shortly after gaining power, and it's his hope to reestablish some sort of government in the region and get money flowing back into the coffers. Getting people to move there is the trick. He's periodically sent in patrols to show that the region is safe, regardless of the reputation. Finding new rulers is easy, as he can reward any one of his enemies by giving them a title and relocating them to the now imperial territory of Altenia. That's one version of where to establish Ispa. It's not canon, and its creation is of my own making. But this does kill one of the largest continuity problems with the Red Steel, and where the hell did all these people come from? It's plausible, it doesn't step on any established canon, and it gives you a lot of plot hooks in the process. How canon is this article? Only as much as you cram into your head. This is a fill-in-the-hole style video where I'm trying to flesh out a part of Mystara that has yet to be talked about, but definitely exists in some measure. I'm stealing from history because this is Mystara, and the Numerus Batavorum deserves some love in a fantasy setting. That's Julius Caesar's Germanic bodyguard, for those wondering. Use as much as you like, steal it if you need it, and ignore what you don't like. Caveat out of the way, let's dive in. Hours after the Spike invasion failed due to the leadership of the future Emperor Thencall, he found himself with a problem. The legions were now following him, and the surviving senators made sure to support him publicly. The previous emperor wasn't even cold yet before Thencall had taken the throne. But he knew the risks of leading Thyatis. Its reputation of duplicity was well earned. More than one emperor had been assassinated less than a month into their reign. Thencall planned on a good long period on the throne, and had no plans to die immediately after his victory. He had a formal bodyguard provided by Thyacian law, but he needed an incorruptible group that he could trust. The first batch of bodyguards was handpicked from the Gladiators that had rallied to Thencall during the invasion. This initial group was known for being utterly loyal to the Emperor, but not very good at looking for potential assassins. They were trained to fight in a pit, not sniffing out ambushes or testing for poisons. They were beloved by the people as they wore stylized uniforms reflecting their past, but only with more armor to protect them. They consisted of all manner of races, with men and women recruited alike. The problems began to appear when the bodyguards refused to follow orders or use their positions to bully people they didn't like. While the crowds loved them, there were better solutions for Thencall's security needs. After a close call with an assassin in the middle of the night, Thencall released his bodyguards from his service. He made a point of honoring them with a giant festival, making them feel like heroes of the Empire rather than a bunch of freshly canned throwaways. Many of the original guards took jobs with the various power players, which also softened the impact of getting sacked. Thencall was still loyal to them. They were his troops. He wasn't going to abandon them. But he also wanted people that could actually do the job he hired them for. The Emperor needed a new bodyguard. Technically, this role fell to the first cohort of the First Legion, but they were all Thyacian. Thyacians, if you remember, have a terrible reputation for backstabbing. Thencall had purged a large number of officers from the military, as well as their powerful patrons. The army had grown soft and incompetent due to corruption. He was cutting out the rot and replaced the purged with competent officers loyal to him. But this made him more enemies than solved problems initially. Several officers relieved of command came from the First Legion, making Thencall's trust in the unit skeptical at best. Thencall needed warriors, ones loyal to him and him alone. He decided to retain the more competent gladiators and recruit his new bodyguards from his original home of Oceansyn. During the Spike invasion, Oceansyn declared itself a free city because the Alphasians were destroying all Thyacian outposts in Norwald. Despite their so-called neutrality, many of their warriors jumped at the chance to serve as the bodyguard of the gladiator now turned emperor. After evaluation and training, 90 warriors and 10 former gladiators were selected as the first Skjoldervord. The impact was immediate. Many of the first cohort, the original bodyguard, were outraged by being officially replaced. Thencall had banished them from his palace, having placed them as guards around important buildings in the capital. This did little to appease them, though increasing their already substantial pay did help a little. Thincal finally devised a solution that removed the first cohort from the city, but allowed them to keep their prestige. He made the highest-ranking general in the First Legion his representative outside the Empire, and reassigned the first cohort to guard him. They couldn't refuse the order, and assassinating the general would harm their reputation. If the general returned to Thyatis City, the first cohort would revert to guarding Thincal. Fortunately, the general was a hand-picked replacement and spent the next few years reinforcing Thyacian holdings, giving the Emperor time to establish his new bodyguards. Thincal's decisions paid off in dividends soon after the Skjoldervord were established. While the Emperor was parading in front of a village on a tour of his nation, Alphatian agents tried to ambush him from a crowd. Thincal was pulled back behind the ranks of his guards, who dispatched the enemies with some effort. This left Thincal unharmed, but concerned that the assassins had gotten too close without warning. After replacing multiple food tasters and having more than one arrow stopped by a bodyguard's shield, he realized he would need to expand the effectiveness of his guards. What was a single century of Skjoldervord was broadened into a cohort of 500. The Skjoldervord were now divided into 5 different centuries, each with a different role. The training was customized for each task, but all were trained in combat. To expand the recruiting pool of talent, warriors from Ostland and the Heldonic Freeholds were permitted to join. The recruits were hired in private, as the identity of the Skjoldervord is a well-guarded secret to avoid attempted corruption or replacements with enemy infiltrators. It is known that the recruits come from the northern lands, but which warriors guard the Emperor and which are merely mercenaries working for Thyatis is never revealed. The life of a Skjoldervord is filled with danger, but it's also a comfortable one. A member is paid triple of that of a legionnaire, with more experienced members earning even more. The ones that physically guard Thincal are given Thyacian names to use publicly, but keep their original names private. The other Skjoldervord's identities are state secrets, working undercover to protect Thincal and his immediate family. Even the imperial family doesn't know which servant is merely a chambermaid, and which is a trained killer there to protect them. This keeps the Emperor's enemies guessing, making plotting and assassination difficult. The Skjoldervord have access to the best clerical healing available, and are provided with magic weapons, armors, and other items they keep if they finish their service with distinction. They are regularly rotated on or off to keep them fresh, and to make it more difficult for enemies to discover their true identities. Thincal keeps their books off the budget and pays them directly through his own coffers. The Skjoldervord are fully aware of where their gold and shiny magic items come from, making betraying their employer even less likely. Their high morale, training, and logistical support makes them one of the deadliest groups in Thyatis. The true number of Skjoldervord is only known to the Emperor and the group's leaders, but is broken down into 5 centuries, each with 100 agents on average. Each century has little to do with the others. Most members only know of the existence of the other centuries, except for the Skjoldervord Primus, which serves as the group's public face. The higher-ranking members are informed of the full scope of their organization, and will coordinate with each other to maximize the protection provided. The Skjoldervord Primus are what people think of when Thincal's personal guard is mentioned. Known to the group's officers as the Face, they are all large men. Their uniforms make them stand out in any crowd, being a stylized version of what the Thyacians picture as northern warriors. They are famous for their bearskin helmets and capes, their muscle cuirass, and an obscuring face mask in the shape of Thincal's visage. This makes them intimidating, as well as anonymous. Despite their often gaudy appearance, each is a skilled warrior willing to lay down his life for the Emperor. Thincal is only seen in public with at least 10 of these warriors surrounding him, unless the location prohibits men under arms by Thyacian law, such as the Imperial Senate. Harold Forkbeard, a former gladiator from the first incarnations of bodyguards, leads Primus. He is a mountain of a man, standing a head taller than the rest of his men. It was his idea to recruit guards that didn't speak Thyacian proper. His men are fluent in Heldan, but even their grasp of the common tongue isn't the greatest. On duty, he's a silent giant, scanning the room constantly or becoming Thincal's shadow in public. Off duty, he loves to carouse, and barroom brawling is his favorite hobby. It's said he left Ostland because he killed a man with a single punch. In reality, he couldn't afford to pay for the damage he caused after a particularly raucous scrum. The Skjoldervord Secundus are called the Eyes, the second group of bodyguards who secretly protect Thincal. Unlike the Face, they dress in ordinary clothes of their surroundings and pose as anything from servants to staff to guests. They secretly keep an eye on crowds looking for threat, which they then alert members of the Face with secret hand gestures. The 2 cohorts are trained together, and like all members of the Skjoldervord, they're fluent in Heldan, allowing them to pass or receive messages through simple eavesdropping, without the larger crowds being aware of what's happening. They're trained in combat, and will be sporting at least one hidden weapon at all times. They won't normally engage a threat, preferring to let the heavier armed and, more importantly, armored Primus deal with it. However, they will not hesitate to engage an assassin if the danger is immediate. Mildred the Wise, as her men call her, is the leader of Secundus. She is a wise woman from Ostland, brought down after Thincal purchased her service. By purchasing her service, the Thyacians completely renovated her village's docks to become rather impressive. She is always looking for signs from the Aether and will read the runes to determine possible threats. This makes her appear timid and skittish, as she sometimes trusts the runes more than her judgment. Her methods have proven to be correct from the number of threats she stopped before they get developed, so nobody complains. The Skjoldervord Tertius are the ears and work as the agents looking for possible threats. They pose as all sorts of positions in civilian life, but they are all connected to some aspect of Thyacian society. They can be merchants, tailors, customs agents, or less savory professions like smugglers or fences. They listen for growing threats and pass the information up the chain of command. A side effect of this is they are also quite good at catching corrupt members of the city watch that try to extort a bribe from them. When they find a conspiracy, they never try to stop it. Instead, members of the Primus, Quintus, or even the City Watch will be the ones that make the arrest, or arrange a highly elaborate yet completely plausible accident in terms of the Quintus. Deirdre Hrolfsdottir is a mage from Oceansyn that leads the Tertius. She is distrustful of others, but can put on a persona of aloofness. She gained the position through competence. She uncovered 4 conspiracies in her few years of service. When the previous head of Tertius's term ended, she was promoted. Her current cover is running an import-export store for the upper crust of Thyacian society, where she listens on private conversations through various false walls. Her standoffish personality makes the elite think she's one of them, causing them to let her guard down. One side effect of her acceptance into high society is her store does turn a hefty profit, and much of Tertius's budget is generated from her sales. The Quartus is known as the Heart, and this cohort protects the imperial family behind the scenes. Not Thincal, as he's guarded exclusively by the Primus and Secundus, but the Empress and all their children. The Quartus appear as members of the imperial household, from guards to minor administrators to even maids and gardeners. They space themselves out, so the Emperor and the children are always in the presence of at least one of them. Most of their charges aren't even aware of the identities of their protectors. However, Crown Prince Eusebius was briefed on the nature of the group after he successfully identified 2 guards constantly watching him with interest. Even Princess Astorella has 10 men assigned to her through an arrangement with the Alphatian court. In return, Prince Tridorian has several Alphatian bodyguards along with his standard security detail. In case of an attempt on one of the imperial family, the Quartus springs into action by attacking the assailant while raising the alarm simultaneously. The speed at which the Quartus can converge on a location is impressive and quite surprising to a conspirator or a misguided suitor. Ariadne Bjornsdottir is the head of the Quartus and is relatively young for her position, as she's only in her mid-20s. She poses as a maid for Empress Gabriella's quarters. She was promoted because of her competence and a particular skill she possessed. Ariadne is trained in all weapons, but is quite lethal with all manners of cloth. She's strangled several men with scarves, towels, and in one case by shoving a napkin down an attacker's throat. Her actual leadership role is little more than assigning weekly schedules, as the Quartus are all chosen for their talents and need little supervision. The Quintus are known as the Arm, the division of the Skjoldervord that even some of their own don't know about. They are the assassins of the Emperor, striking down potential threats before they become actual threats. Many are murderers saved from death sentences in the northern reaches, only now to be rewarded for their killer talents. The different assignments are given to the various members based on skill. The Quintus are filled with poisoners, cutthroats, arsonists, stranglers, and all other manner of killers. They are trained in restraint and are experts at framing another for their deed. Their talents have allowed Thincal to bring down one rival by framing him for the death of another rival. Hrothgar the Sly is the tentative head of the Quintus, though this means he gets the toughest assignments. On paper, the Helldowner is serving a 10-year sentence for smuggling, but he's only in his cell for special visits from suspicious guardsmen. He can exit through a secret door in his cell, and if he needs to be in 2 places simultaneously, the Quintus will provide a duplicate through magic. His versatility is his strength. He can kill someone in a variety of ways and will find new ways to murder someone on request. He's one of Thincal's favorite servants, and the one he can't acknowledge in any way. That's the story behind the Skjoldervord. They aren't canon in any sense of the word. They provide background information and will make the player's life more difficult or easy based on intentions. If they have to sneak through the Imperial Palace, they don't know if the maid can be bribed, threatened, seduced, or will kill all of them with a doily. Eusebius is a genius, a rarity for fighters. His intelligence score is a staggering 16, while his wisdom is only 10. Intelligence doesn't give many bonuses for the fighting types in most versions of D&D, typically only additional skills. 5th edition doesn't even give them that. But Eusebius is a perfect example of how to handle a fighter that knows his way around history books and mathematics. Now, if only TSR had given them more than 4 lines of details in the almanacs. Fortunately, Joshua finally gives us all the skinny. According to Dawn of the Emperors, Eusebius at the time of the Gazetteers was 36 years old, born in 261 AC. So unless time flows differently for the Crown Prince of Alphatia, that's a typo, and he was instead born in 961 AD. His youth was spent being raised and taught by valets and soldiers. He was quite popular among the legionnaires. They considered him a good luck charm and eventually one of their own. His father was too busy running the empire to spend too much time siring his son. His mother was in a perpetual malaise from being discarded as soon as she'd given Thingol a son to perform her motherly tasks. From all accounts, he was a studious child, though not a friendly one. He had the best friends that money could buy. Not that the children his age were in it for the money. They were literally being paid to pretend to be friends with the prince. When he reached 18, he was sent to the Westreach Military Academy in Corindus, where he studied as a cavalry officer. He was a good soldier, rising in the ranks to captain on merit rather than just because he would become the next emperor. He served with distinction until age 30, when he resigned his commission at his father's request to learn how to be emperor. He is married and sired 2 sons in the 6 years since that happened. He is a tactical genius from a stat block, though despite every single source saying he's a highly effective administrator and knowledgeable in finances, history, and law, he lacks any skills pertaining to the ones Dawn of the Emperors and the Poor Wizard's almanacs praise him for. The prince learned well from his father. They share a skill for manipulation, though Eusebius has nowhere near the charisma of his father. Much like the emperor, he sees people as tools rather than individuals. If you're useful to him, he rewards you. If you're a hindrance, he casts you off, if you're lucky. The only exception to this is his sister Stephania. She was the one that defied their father, the one that lived life on her terms, and the one member of his family that had no ambitions for the throne. Despite being nearly a decade apart in age, since her return, she's been his primary confidant, possibly even more than his wife Lucinia. The future Empress Lucinia is the niece of Maldinius Corindus, the Duke of Corindus. Their marriage was political. He was 7 years her senior. They seem to be a happy couple. Actually happy, not the sham marriage put on by Thingol and Gabriella. She is a bard and shares her husband's love of history and lore. She's also quite charming, as befits a bard, and she's a favorite among the populace. Eusebius allows her to engage in her musical hobbies, as she picks up all sorts of secrets while performing. She will even travel to put on shows, though never far. The restriction is more logistical than Eusebius controlling her. She's required to travel with an entire entourage of bodyguards. The further she goes, the more it costs the empire. A compromise was made to satisfy her desire to showcase her talents and her husband's frugal nature. Eusebius and Lucinia have 2 sons, only one of which causes a continuity problem. Their oldest is Coltius, born in 994 AC. He enjoys traveling, but is only rarely allowed to venture far because of the security risks. He is close to his Aunt Stephania and his Aunt Asterelia, though at the time of his birth, the latter was the official hostage in Alphatia. Depending on what book you read, he's either spiteful and resents his parents, or he's happy and go-lucky but loyal to his father while taking after his mother. Go with the version given in Joshuan's. It's far more interesting than the Poor Wizard's Almanac's version. Plus, Joshuan, despite all of its faults, gives you 3 full paragraphs on the future emperor rather than just 6 lines. Coltius has decided to become a bard like his mother. He's even more charismatic than her and almost as intelligent as his father. And his wisdom score ain't half bad either. He would make for a fantastic emperor and the first good-aligned one in at least a century. His brother Gabronius was born in 999 AC, so there's not much of a history on him due to his young age. When the Mystara timeline ends, he's just becoming a teenager. Gabronius is shy and withdrawn, overwhelmed by the political game that is Thyatis. He's a bit clumsy with a stutter when frightened, but his parents are trying to coax him into becoming more relaxed. He has no adventuring class yet, and since his stats are never given, we don't know which way he'll go. Eusebius was soaking up all the lessons from his father that he could, and he was patiently waiting to be emperor. Well, not that patiently. Thingol was chugging potions of longevity like they were sugarcane Dr. Pepper. The one in the green bottles, the one that was originally bottled only in Dublin. Yeah, that's the stuff. Oh, that's Dublin, Texas, not Dublin, Ireland. But if you are Irish, try and get your hands on this liquid ambrosia. You'll thank me later. Seriously, Dr. Pepper, you've got the choice of pure imperial sugar and corn syrup, and you give us the one that's made out of corn syrup. Go back to the original recipe, the better recipe. Where was I? Oh yeah, Eusebius. The crown prince is waiting for his father to die so he can get the throne, just not too long. His original plan was to retire his father around 1010 AC when Eusebius was in his mid-40s. Wasn't going to kill his father was useful, and Eusebius is a bit of a family man. Thingol cared for his children in his own detached and frigid way. High charisma will score points with your kids even if you can't remember their birthdays. His original plan was to send his father to live out his days in the Duchy of Mositius, the luxury resort island of Thyatis. Then Eusebius would thank his father and encourage him to go on that quest for immortality he'd been putting off all these years. and not to worry, his son could handle the running of the empire just fine. Eusebius had learned from the best. But then Wrath of the Immortals happened. Thyatis fought a long and bloody stalemate with Alphatia, and despite technically winning the war due to the destruction of Alphatia, it was absolutely devastated. It didn't help that Thyatia unleashed mummy rot all over the empire and destroyed their grain harvest. His father was cursed by Vanya for making peace with Alphatia, despite the fact that it was her prodding that got him to start the ill-advised war that Thyatis could not realistically win if Alphatia was on top of its game for once. In 1011, Thincol had a severe stroke and was bedridden, incapable of speaking clearly. Eusebius became the Prince Regent and assumed control of the empire. Thincol would survive another 5 months before dying of old age. The stroke and his recent illness didn't help. During this time, Eusebius had become appalled at the poor state of Thyatis and began emergency austerity measures. He won many people over when he cut his coronation celebration from a month to a day. Providing the crowds with free bread also helped. He began to reduce the bloated government to a more manageable size and remove corrupt bureaucrats, often lethally. He quickly made a name for himself for being ruthlessly pragmatic. The new emperor first sent his sister on a diplomatic tour to try and secure food for the starving Thyacians. The Thothian curse and sabotage had killed over 100,000 Thyacians through disease or starvation. A tenth of the empire was now dead. While Eusebius loathed to deplete the empire's already spent coffers further, he didn't want to rule over a nation of corpses. He raised much of the gold to acquire the grain and hire the clerics to end the plague by removing many of his family's rivals on trumped-up charges and seizing their wealth in the process. And some of those charges weren't that trumped up. Feeding and curing the populace would secure their loyalty. Paying for it with the wealth of his enemies was just the cherry on top. Eusebius immediately ceased all conflicts Thyatis was currently involved in. His sister hammered out a peace treaty with Thottia to end the war with the pharaoh. He increased colonization of the Isle of Dawn. With Alphatia gone, no one could stop him. His importation of grains and the heavy use of clerics to remove the spread of the mummy rot ended the plague and even ensures the nation has a food surplus for the winter. This act endears him to the citizens of Thyatis. His crackdown on corrupt officials using the purge of Eusebius' enemies to increase their wealth also doesn't go unnoticed. He ends the practice when he sees how far the abuse has spread and begins an investigation into the officials responsible. Eusebius' most significant strength is his judgment of character. He can tell who is best for a job and will bring them into his sphere of influence, even if he doesn't need their service for some time. This is what happened when he assumed the throne. The people he had set in place to join the government when he was crowned were some of the most capable nobles, bureaucrats, and soldiers Thyatis had to offer. When he set his government in place, his enemies were caught off guard on how competent the new emperor and his government were. He is terrifyingly intelligent, knows his weaknesses, and knows how to compensate for them. His relationship with his sister is more than just a sibling bond. He recognizes her talents and his need for them. She is charismatic, whereas he is droll. She is far less rash when angry than he is. But he learned from the tutors and scholars growing up, and she was more interested in living life to its fullest than picking up book knowledge. The emperor is a private man. He does not like public speaking. His speeches to the Senate will be read from a scroll matter of fact rather than resembling any heroic diatribe. He relies on accomplishments rather than propaganda and charity to win the crowd over. He knows the average citizen will be more content if there is bread at the local store than another month of games in the Colosseum. He is frugal, but he's not risk-averse. His first task was stabilizing the empire after the disastrous war and the equally damaging plague. Now that he's accomplished that, he's looking to expand the empire and increase its wealth. His success has made him incredibly popular in Thyatis, though he rarely addresses the crowd, leaving that to his heralds, his sister, and his wife. He's happy sitting in the imperial palace, reviewing taxation reports and expense accounts. The players will not meet Eusebius until they're at least 9th level. He will hear about them and track their progress if they prove themselves capable adventurers. When he gains the throne, you can bet the characters will hear from him and be drafted into his plans. If they succeed in their missions, they will have the full support of the Thyacian government. If they screw up, they will find themselves out of work and out of favor. If they really screw up, I hope they know how to fight with a net and trident. Thus ends the story of Emperor Eusebius. There was very little information on him until literally the last book with Joshua's Almanac. Then it was all of the information on him. He's a little-known but major character that needed some love. The island of Mositius is located due east of the county of Hadius, surrounded by the protectorate of Chariot to the north, Borodos to the east, and Actius and Scalaris to the south. Plus a pair of nasty reefs were found a few miles away from either side of the island's northern half. Approaching the island is best done from the south, with ships coming down the coast of Hadius until they turn and approach Mositius. The island is approximately 75 miles long and 25 miles across at the widest point. The island's interior is mainly used for wine and agricultural production, with beautiful sandy beaches lining almost the entirety of Mositius. The island wasn't always known as the paradise it is today. For the longest it laid uninhabited because of Mount Mositius, an ever-smoking volcano located centrally on the island. Nobody wanted to be next-door neighbors to a mountain that could wipe them out without notice, so people stayed away. It didn't help that the approach to the island was limited by the reefs, making Mositius even less desirable for habitation. But one woman changed all that. Triella Tien Tang, an adventurer of mixed Thyacian and Ochelean heritage, gathered the courage to investigate the volcano and found something quite unexpected. Instead of an active volcano, the mists came from a small brass artifact that she named the Censer of the Mists. This lone magic item generated all the vapors pouring down the peak. Most of the time, the mist was benign, having no effect on the people breathing it. But several times a month, the mist coming down from the censer would change colors, and that's when things got interesting. During these events, the mists affected people's emotions, just for a few hours. Anyone breathing the magical vapors would share the same emotion. Usually this emotion was harmless, if not beneficial. Emotions like giddiness, optimism, love, or laziness were the most common. But occasionally the emotions manifested as rage, uncontrollable lust, or fear that could affect the entire island. Tien Tang developed a method to contain the mists, only releasing them when she wanted to. Then she went to work making Mositius the entertainment capital of Thyatis. Triella Tien Tang is an inspirational story of self-made success in Thyatis, especially in her hometown of West Portage. She started her adventuring career relatively late, becoming a wizard at the age of 28 when a traveling magician discovered her potential. She left the Isle of Dawn and moved to Thyatis City to expand on her studies a few years later. There she met and befriended the future Emperor Thinkal during her adventures, and when he led the charge during the Spike invasion, she was right there at his side. She retired from adventuring after that to begin her research into arcane matters. During this retirement, she found the secret of Mositius. She petitioned Thinkal to become the Baroness of the island, a request her old friend agreed to with some provisions. She had a solid plan to turn the barren island into a profitable addition to the empire. When she implemented her designs, it generated so much interest and, more importantly, income. She was quickly promoted to Countess, and then even faster to Duchess. Even Tien Tang was amazed how successful she was, as Mositius went from an unpopulated island into a status symbol. In the decades since the Duchess started converting the island into a tourism mecca, it has become almost unrecognizable from the simple town she envisioned. The island has only a single large town, the port of Argivan, at the foot of the volcano. Here the streets are lined with all manners of entertainment. Visitors can go from playhouse to music hall to tavern to brothel to casino without ever stepping on the road outside. By ducal law, every business in Mositius has to remain open every hour of the day, giving the island a reputation of constant movement. Not every form of entertainment provided is visceral or physical. Many art galleries are found on the island, some of which are the most exclusive in the empire. Marinas dot the coastline across the island, and regattas and simple boat tours are held almost daily. An entrepreneurial group of Aquarindi elves even started an undersea sightseeing tour, using magic to take visitors on excursions to the wonders below the waves. While ships tend to avoid the island's northern section because of the reefs, a peculiar form of entertainment can be found there, brought over from the Pearl Islands. People have taken to standing on wooden planks and riding the waves found off the northern beaches. There's surfing. You don't need to disguise the language, TSR. You've given us surfing Romans. Every bit of entertainment on the island is planned well in advance, part of Tien Tang's grand design for the island. Competing businesses must be a certain distance apart to avoid visitors having to choose between two adjacent venues. Many of the more illustrious hotels or halls have a waiting list often a year in advance. The island targets young nobles and aims for repeat business. For those that can afford it, Mositius is the #1 destination for weddings, reunions, business meetings, bachelor parties, retirement parties, and the best place for successful adventurers to lessen the load of their latest dungeon crawl. The festivities are ridiculously expensive. Few can afford to stay more than a few days. Even simple inns or hostels cost several times that of their mainland equivalents. But a vacation in Mositius is something that most Thyacians dream of. For the truly wealthy, regular trips here are a status symbol. One of the reasons for the island's constant flow of tourism is the training the staff receives in catering to the guests' whims. Mositius doesn't turn away anyone with the coin to visit. A ship full of privateers returning from a successful foray is as welcome as the family reunion of a powerful senator, but they will be provided with different diversions. The guards employed in Argivan are trained to politely direct rowdier patrons to facilities where they can carouse without disturbing other guests. The typical staff member can placate an arrogant Ochelean noble 1 minute and turn around to suggest to a group of half-drunk legionnaires back from a campaign where the most affordable brothel is. A night in Argivan is one to remember because of the massive assortment of Thyacian citizens looking for a good time. It's even more impressive that the guards and hired help keep them all happy and diverted away from each other. The vineyards are in the center of the island, producing some of the finest grapes in the known world. Guests rarely venture here unless they want a tour of the vineyards or just a wine tasting. There's not much in the form of entertainment outside some specialized interests like polo grounds or horse racing. The wines are highly sought after on the mainland, but only a small number of bottles are exported. Most of the wines cultivated here are for use by visitors only. This also means that most of Mositius' food must be imported, but with the vast wealth generated, that's rarely a problem. Shipments from Thyatis City, Minrathad, and even more exotic ports arrive daily, making the selection of food and drink here almost unrivaled. If you have the coin, Mositius can provide it for you. Because of this service, it also has the largest population of hen per capita in Thyatis. Many cooks are from the 5 shires, and the best chefs have become quite famous and wealthy. Duchess Tian Tang lives high at the peak of Mount Mositius, where she plans the future of her duchy. Her time is spent looking at scheduled events, VIP visits, and other significant details. She doles out the day-to-day operations of the island to her assistants. These individuals are highly competent, hand-picked, and well-paid. Visitors rarely see the Duchess except for major events like holidays when she makes a well-publicized appearance. She has a flair for the dramatic and shares the Thyacian love for the exotic. Many of her staff and guards are chosen specifically because of their appearance in addition to their talent. Her ducal guard is represented by individuals from all across the empire and even other nations. The volcano is heavily guarded by her elite troops and backed up by 3 dragons hired to provide air support if necessary and otherwise impress the guests. The most notable aspect of the islands is the mists, of course. Tian Tang keeps the censer locked away in an airtight room to prevent the mists from covering parts of the island. When the mists change colors, she sends in several slaves to see what the effects are. If the effect is positive, she opens up the dome and lets the mists flow down to the island. If it's a negative one, she keeps the dome shut and hopes the slaves aren't too badly affected. The mists occur randomly, never more than once a week, but at least once a year. She can't schedule when they happen or what the effect will be, but this randomness adds to the island's mystique. The effects of the mists only last 6 hours, and the release has to be authorized by Tian Tang, so she is alerted as soon as the mists change colors. She will make the call if they are potentially hazardous, like when the mists cause an increased sense of adventure. This resulted in multiple accidental deaths from risky actions, but the casino's income greatly increased as well. The mists either blanket the entire island or just the city of Argivan, depending on the source you're reading from. Regardless of the source of the lore, the effect of the mist covers Mositius entirely. Despite the wealth that can be found on the island, violent crime is almost unheard of. Part of this is because of the strict weapon laws. Only daggers are allowed on the island, and any form of armor is prohibited. While quite polite and understanding, the guards are still highly trained and more than capable of defending themselves. The first thing a guard does when confronting a belligerent is to call for backup, and there's always more guards just out of sight ready to respond. But even then, the guards will be more than happy to direct an angry drunk to an establishment that will cater to their desire, as many of the bars have fighting pits for people to work out their energies on other willing patrons. The biggest threat is the non-violent criminals, as conmen and pickpockets are a constant threat. A word of warning, the volcano is strictly off-limits to visitors without an invitation. The elite guards are even better trained and far less understanding than the regular guards. Plus, they can call in dragons as a backup. The only other prominent location on the island is Cunius Tower, on the island's northern tip. It appears to be made from a single gigantic piece of ivory, hollowed out, and turned into a beacon to warn ships away from the rocks. It can be toured for a price, though its actual origin is a mystery and seems to change with every retailing by the lighthouse keeper. While the tower is famous for its beauty, it's also fully functional and discreetly guarded by a contingent of troops. The last thing the Duchess needs is a shipwreck to mar the reputation of her island. That's the story of Mositius. If you haven't thought of a dozen adventure hooks by now, I've failed as a narrator. Any story involving players at a fancy gala, casino, or art gallery can be placed here. If the party has too much money, send them to Argivan, where the cheap rooms are 100 gold pieces a night. There they can drink the finest wines, dance the night away, head out for a brothel crawl, or try to rob 3 casinos in one go. If you have a heist adventure that needs a setting, Mositius is more than ready to be that place. The area known to the Thyacian people as the Hinterlands is a relatively small territory on the coast of Devania, due south of the island of Ochelia. It's not a unified nation, but rather a collection of 4 allied tribal kingdoms, the Raven, the Wolf, the Horse, and the Lion. They refer to their homeland as Ravenland, Wolfland, etc., and recognize the area as 4 distinct regions rather than just one. It's a verdant place of rolling hills, thick forests, and thousands of small villages dotting the landscape. There's only 4 actual cities, the meeting places for each of the tribes, horse meat, lion meat, and so on. They aren't actual cities, as while people do live in them year-round, they only swell in population once per year when the various members of each tribe converge. That was the basic explanation for the geography of the Hinterlands, until Poor Wizard's Almanac 2 was released. Now the Hinterlands are part of the Jungle Coast, as explained by Haldemar of Hacken. It's all jungle all over the place. The horse, lion, and wolf tribes are gone, replaced by the jackal, rhino, and leopard tribes. The entire region has been changed to vast, impenetrable jungles, and yet kept the Gallic theme that was the origin of the Hinterlands. The new reimagining doesn't explain any of the changes. It's only a nation on the jungle coast, and it's all jungle now. This doesn't retcon any part of the history of Thyatis. It only turns the region's geography from Orleans to French Guiana. Time to address this problem. Let me go get the MiG. Swear I'm going to do a live stream in a welding mask one day. Maybe fix that continuity stream where YouTube and Cyberlink decided they weren't on speaking terms that night. The issue you have is that the Hinterlands are central France, both in geography and in the theme of the invasion, which obviously parallels Caesar's conquest of Gaul. It loses part of the charm if the Romans and Gauls fight in densely packed jungles. Put the blame on Haldimar, as he's never visited the region. It's currently under attack by the sworn enemy of his empire, after all. But he did visit the kingdom of Imeron to the south, which is populated by a race of plant-animal hybrids who are very tied to nature. But they haven't explored the hinterlands and assume the geography, and more importantly fauna, would be much like theirs. Haldimar has fallen into the trap he criticized his predecessors for. He didn't visit the region he was talking about, using a secondary source. This is out of safety rather than laziness. The last thing he wants is to get the Princess Ark captured by Phaeacians. Now that I've fixed the glaring contradictions between the two books in the same setting, back to talking about the hinterlands. The culture of all the tribes values physical strength more than any other trait. They idolize individual heroics, and their combat tactics reflect this, as all the warriors will fight independently rather than using any formation. Hinterlanders are some of the tallest people in the known world, with most men standing 6 feet or taller on average, and the women being a few inches shorter, or as one famous dancer once put it, standing a full 5'12". Hair color tends to be blonde or reddish, with darker shades possible. Blue and green eyes are also common. The Hinterlanders are fair-skinned, though they are typically well-tanned due to their behavior. They respect magic and treat both clerics and mages with reverence. Even if a wizard is frail in constitution, the Hinterlanders appreciate the ability to blow people up with a few words and gestures. The invasion of the Hinterlands started 12 years ago when Emperor Thincall was looking for something to rally the people around. Over 1,000 years ago, the future Phaeacians were chased from this very spot by the now long-dead Millennian Empire. However, Phaeacian history of that event has been distorted over the centuries. The Empire holds a special fondness for their former lands and decided they needed to get them back. The tribes living there had no idea who the Phaeacians were, as they'd moved into the area decades after the previous inhabitants left. For the Hinterlanders, the Phaeacians just showed up and started conquering them. The legions landed near Ravenholm, the northernmost of the tribal cities. 2 whole legions were dispatched to deal with the tribes, with a third landing far to the east in Devania and playing no part in the conquest. There were multiple skirmishes between the tribes and the legions, with the first significant battle coming outside of Ravenholm, with the might of that tribe taking on both legions. The Hinterlanders charged at the lines with savage fury and were promptly curb-stomped. The tribal warriors fought individually, and despite their larger size and individual prowess, were no match for an army that fought as one, and didn't hesitate to shower their enemies with arrows and artillery first. To save what little remained of his army, the Raven King surrendered to the Phaeacians. Though stripped of his title, he was allowed to live and forced to swear allegiance. The troops that surrendered with him were disarmed and sent home. He's known to the Hinterlanders as the biggest coward in their history, and he is scorned and mocked not just by the other tribes, but the few remaining free members of his own. In his defense, his surrender meant the Phaeacians only killed 75% of his army rather than 100%. After the battle, the Phaeacians began to build infrastructure in the conquered territories. Ravenholm was renamed Ravenscarp and converted into a military staging ground for the legions. The other tribal lands were heavily forested, so Thyatis took a slower approach to grind down the opposition. It's been over a decade, and the territory is only 50% under Phaeacian control. The Hinterlanders have learned their lessons from the early battles and are fighting a guerrilla war rather than a stand-up fight. This favors the one-on-one style of combat the tribes prefer, but their refusal to fight as an actual army still hinders their progress. Tribal loyalty still runs strong. Old grudges mean uniting even a single tribe is almost impossible. One war chief won't go into battle along another war chief because of some ancient grudge or personal slight. Every year, a few more war chiefs are killed, and their lands are conquered, reducing the resistance against the invaders. It's starting to look like not if the Phaeacians will conquer the hinterlands, but when. The slow progress of the invasion looks to outsiders like the Phaeacians are bogged down in the conflict when the opposite is true. The Exarch, or Phaeacian provisional ruler of Ravenscarp, is systematically bringing the conquered hinterlanders under Phaeacian influence. The tribes had no written language. The Exarch decreed that every hinterlander child be taught Phaeacian. Conquered villages were renovated by the engineers that accompany every Phaeacian legion. Where most tribal villages stood isolated, they're now connected by paved roads that have increased travel and boosted trade. The Exarch is trying to win the people's minds rather than rule them through fear.
The policy has begun to pay off. In Ravenscarp, it's not uncommon to hear natives speaking Thyacian instead of the Hinterlander tongue. An auxiliary unit has been raised from Hinterlander volunteers and used in other battlefields, such as the Isle of Dawn. The citizens of Ravenscarp are starting to think like Thyacians, though they still have their love of personal glory. Surprisingly, many of them have relocated to Brunn as adventurers to pursue wealth and fame. Their large size and love of adventure suits them well there. Of the 3 remaining tribes, 2 of them are being pushed back slowly but steadily. This is where the continuity snarl makes things difficult. 2 tribes are actively being driven back by the legions, while the westernmost is contained by a line of Thyacian forts. The Poor Wizard's Almanac says the Rhino tribe will be the next to fall, and the Jackal tribe after that. This leaves the Leopard tribe as the one being held back. But again, the tribal names in the box set, the first canon appearance, says that the tribes are the Horse, Lion, and Wolf. What makes it worse is that the map in Dawn of the Emperor says the Hinterlander map is on page 69, dude. But the map is just blank, showing the overall borders of the territory with nothing labeled. So randomly assigning names? The Horse is the next to fall instead of the Rhino. Lion replaces Jackal, and Wolf is the equivalent of the Leopard. Besides, who ever heard of a French Rhino? The Thyacians use the Hinterlands as a training ground for their legions, cycling through them with some regularity to have all their various troops with some combat experience. Currently, 2 Hadian legions are in the area. The 9th Legion is based at Ravenscarp and for years was the primary invasion force, before being relocated to the provincial capital for resupply and rest. They have become one of the most battle-tested forces in Thyatis, having fought the Hinterlanders for the better part of a decade. The 10th Legion has been the vanguard for the invasion from the very start. They were the legion that decimated the Raven tribe and have borne the brunt of the attacks from the Horse and Lion tribes. They're about to be cycled back to Thyatis due to reports that they're losing their combat effectiveness due to the losses in fatigue. Other units that have seen combat in the Hinterlands include some of the most famous Thyacian detachments. The Retebius Air Fleet was initially part of the invasion, providing both intelligence and aerial support to the 10th Legion. They were called back quickly due to needs in other locations, but small units from the fleet are detached to the Hinterlands as needed. The Foresters have used the Hinterlands primarily as training, as their skill in stealth has made them valuable scouts when the military commanders can acquire them. Most of the Foresters have spent some time in the Hinterlands. Their combat style is a perfect fit for the rolling forests of the region. But again, they're often needed elsewhere, so only small detachments can be found as part of the conquering force, and again only briefly. The 2nd Legion has been deployed there, as Thincall wanted them to test the fighting prowess of the tribesmen to update the Liber Tacticus for future commanders. Another reason the invasion is taking so long is that Thyatis finds the battles useful for hardening and training their forces. The Hinterlanders provide little effective resistance, so why not take advantage of the war? In canon, the Hinterlands are doomed to fail. The only reason they've held out for so long is that the Exarch prefers to improve the conquered territories by providing sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, fresh water system, and public health, rather than steamroller the enemy and rebuild from the ruins. The village they have conquered have been pleasantly surprised that their occupiers are rather competent administrators. The ones that haven't been conquered are learning the hard way that Thincall views them as the perfect target practice. Emphasis on the word practice. The tribes are torn between their pride and the creeping realization that they're not going to win this war. That's the Hinterlands. It has the benefit of not having 1, but 2 complete full write-ups in canon. It's also one of the most Mystaran topics by having both sources completely contradict each other. It's supposed to be Gaul, so go with Dawn of the Emperors and replace all the jungles with rolling forests. Besides, the rhino is tropical. This is a temperate zone, and a 5-ounce bird cannot carry a 3,000-pound rhino. The Collegium Arcanum was first mentioned in Dawn of the Emperors, given a brief description of the Thyatis city entry, including the Poor Wizard's Almanacs, Joshuans, and several brief mentions in other 2nd edition supplements, and even some discussion in Dragon magazine. 9 publications mention it. So it should be one of D&D's most fleshed-out magical schools, right? Well, no. All of the mentions are rehashed entries from the paragraphs in Dawn of the Emperors. Pretty much cut and paste for many of them. The Collegium was founded at the start of the Empire. It's competently run, but it's nowhere near the quality or prestige of Alphatia or Glantry. But it does graduate a large number of wizards in comparison to the other high-quality institutions. You can't just tease us with the equivalent of the Community College of Magic schools and leave it at that. It's time to fill in the blanks where I can, with a huge amount of help from the Vaults of Pandius and Threshold magazine. The majority of this video is fanon, so use what you want. The exact date of the Collegium's founding is a bit uncertain as there's multiple conflicting sources. The best estimate is the school was opened around 3 to 5 AC upon orders of Zentralian the first emperor of Thyatis. It makes sense for them to have a magical academy. Zentralian was allied with a wizard during the revolt, and Alphatia dominated the new empire for centuries with spells. Magic is a powerful tool, something that Thyatis would be negligent not to utilize.
The emperor named a close ally, Dacrist Cost, to be its first headmaster, a position he would hold for many years. Many faculty members were former Alphatian wizards who changed sides during the revolt, seeing a better opportunity for themselves in the fledgling Thyacian Empire. The formative years of the schools were improvised, as students were hard to find and teachers were almost all Alphatian. The Collegium copied the Alphatian school of magic as best it could. Many of its first students were pressed into duty by Zendralian's troops. Anyone who could cast a spell was given a free education, room, board, and employment when they came of age. What they weren't given was a choice. In 20 AC, Empress Valentia assumed the throne and began to stabilize the government with reforms. Among her many changes was the codification of the operation of the Collegium Arcanum. The most significant change to the college was the leadership. The official head of the school was now the Magister Arcanum, whose participation in the actual running of the institution differed wildly over the centuries. Some ran the school like their own fiefdom, dictating what would be taught and hiring and firing professors on a whim. Others preferred a hands-off approach, giving the day-to-day operations to the head proctor of the Collegium Arcanum, and only getting involved if the school became a public embarrassment. Classes were clearly defined during Valentia's reformations, and students were sought out and asked nicely rather than getting pressed into service. The empress wisely concluded that students who wanted to attend classes would serve better than those dragged through the door screaming and shackled to a desk. This led to the income level of the students being less than the Alphatian or Glantrian schools of magic. Still, the Thyacian wizards were more loyal due to the opportunities provided to them that they wouldn't otherwise have. The school's official name is the College of Licinius, after General Licinius, the leader of the Thyacian revolt. In typical Thyacian fashion, Emperor Zendralian honored the late general by immortalizing his name. The fact that Zendralian murdered Licinius to take the throne for himself isn't mentioned. It's widely known, but it's not mentioned in polite society. The college is a block-sized compound located in the heart district of Thyatis City, a straight shot down from the Imperial Library. The school hosts approximately 500 to 700 students depending on the year, though in its past, attendance has dipped below 200 or swelled past 1,000 students due to the whims of the Magister. There is one professor for about every 40 students, each with a handful of teaching assistants of their choosing. Students start classes at the age of 13 for humans and undergo 6 years of schooling. While every student can use magic from day one, the students aren't taught spells until age 16. In the meantime, they are educated in history, literature, mathematics, and a heavy dose of arcane theory. While this means students are considered far behind their Alphatian and Glantrian counterparts in arcane knowledge, it also means that the Collegium Arcanum is one of the only magical universities to have a student survival rate that gets anywhere near 100%. Thyatis prefers its students to be well-educated, well-rounded, and more importantly, alive when they graduate. They don't encourage students to participate in wildly dangerous experiments to impress their professors. They actively forbid risky gambles by underage students. A student who ignores a professor's warnings to go on an adventure in the college alone finds himself expelled rather than praised, even if they did accomplish a heroic deed. Thyacians want people who can follow orders and work alongside others rather than a loose cannon that risks lives for their own personal glory. Unlike Glantrian or Alphatian students at their magical colleges, Thyacian students tend to be from lower-class families. The Collegium Arcanum trains wizards to serve in various roles in the Empire. Classes are free, provided the students pay off their debt through public service. Wealthy wizards receive their training from tutors paid for by their family. If a bricklayer's daughter shows the ability to read magic, he wouldn't be able to afford to give her any formal training. But if she is brought to the attention of her local senator, then the college is more than happy to provide her with the education she needs. While the Collegium is scoffed at in Alphatia, in Thyatis, it's a higher school of learning and a source of pride for families sending a child there. The student lives at the Collegium are tightly controlled. They're not allowed to venture outside the school into the city without supervision, and the younger students aren't allowed to leave the school at all except on approved holidays. This is for their protection, as Thyatis City is a sprawling metropolis and many students are from the countryside. The school itself is actually relatively safe. It has no secret dungeons, no hidden passages. The buildings are well maintained and frequently renovated. Dangerous experiments and books of secret knowledge are kept in other safer locations. The Collegium is located in the middle of the capital city. The professors are not providing the students with any experiments that could level a city block. A special honor guard from the 12th Legion provides security for the Collegium. They are from Port Licinius, and they are the only unit from that normally maritime legion to serve on land. Unlike other magical colleges, there's little risk of kidnapping. The students here rarely come from noble families. A kidnapper snatching a student will find they now have the son or daughter of a common soldier or carpenter. The primary reason for the cheap education is that the students are expected to serve in the military after graduation.
They are pushed that way from almost the first day, with examples of great wizards fighting for the glory of Thyatis, starting with the school's namesake, General Licinius, being taught to them as part of their history classes. The students' education subtly adapts them to the military life, with regimented schedules, required classes, and all the control over their lives. The army needs its officers to be literate, able to calculate numbers in their head and work in high-stress environments. The College of Licinius ensures all of its graduates excel at those skills. Like the Thyacian legions, the classes are regimented and standardized. All students are given the same classes until late in their education. Electives are assigned to students to bolster their strengths in various topics. They have to keep up their grades, as failure is an option. Early classes ensure students have at least the basic knowledge expected in the Thyacian military. The Collegium is the only magic school requiring a physical education course throughout a student's studies. Thyacians take the motto, healthy body, healthy mind, to a whole new level. It's much easier to reflect on how you screwed up and why you won't repeat that mistake running laps through an obstacle course than playing broomstick lacrosse. While the students hate this particular part of their education, they're grateful years later when they can match hardened legionnaires shot for shot during a victory celebration. Alphatian wizards are detested by their troops. Thyacian wizards are seen as brother-in-arms by theirs. After 3 years of standard classes, then students are allowed to learn spells. The professors prefer not to teach students offensive spells until they're at least 16. The thought of 13-year-olds casting magic missile at anyone who annoys them is reason enough. The first spells taught will always be defensive or utility spells. Floating disc is a popular choice, especially with the workload and the number of books required increasing. The Collegium encourages spells that would normally be forbidden at other schools, as it allows the students to showcase their talents. While students might think they are cheating using an ESP spell to get the answer from their teacher's mind, they don't realize that he's drawing the attention of the Thyacian Imperial Intelligence who set up that test. One of the reasons that the other magical colleges look down upon the Collegium Arcanum is that it plays it safe when it comes to spells learned. This is not a research college. Students aren't creating new spells or magic items here. They are taught specific spells in a predetermined order and under close supervision. Every student graduates knowing a complete set of utility spells, a collection of defensive spells, and a handful of mundane but valuable offensive spells. You won't find a Thyacian graduate knowing any spell outside the standard spells from the main rulebook. If they want to learn exotic spells or research their own, they can do that on their own time after graduation. However, compared to wizards from other schools, they will have a well-rounded education and a host of relevant skills, allowing them to find employment in various fields, regardless of their magical knowledge. The last 2 years of a student's education is when they will be singled out for specialized classes. These classes are standardized like most of the other courses, but pupils who showcase talent in specific fields are selected for an enhanced focus. Most students are destined to serve as soldiers in the military, though they graduate with a full commission. But governmental agencies like Imperial Intelligence, diplomatic services, or even engineering schools always need magical assistance. If a student shows they excel at information gathering, diplomacy, or artificing, they will be offered additional lessons after graduation in those fields. This can lead to a life-serving Thyatis in a more specialized role. Thyacians view graduates of the Collegium Arcanum like any other college. They're held in the same regard as a mathematician from the University of Byzantium, a soldier from the Imperial Academy, or a horseman from the Westreach Cavalry Academy in Corindus. But among Thyacian wizards, you get a certain amount of respect from your peers if you sport a class ring from the Collegium Arcanum. That wraps up today's topic. The College of Licinius isn't flashy. That's the point. Students are taught basic spells, but are trained to work together seamlessly. Like all other Thyacian military assets, wizards are meant to be another cog in the war machine. The Collegium ensures that the up-and-coming wizards in the Empire's Legion are precisely that.
In 960 AC, the relationship between Alphatia and Thyatis was waning. The two great empires had never been at peace. Instead, they restricted their battles to the Isle of Dawn to avoid a larger conflict. The empires did have trade agreements, and embassies were established, but little in terms of diplomacy happened between Thyatis City and Sunsval. While the Isle of Dawn was where any flare-ups would occur, Thyacian pirates were growing bolder and striking Alphatian shipping closer to the continent every passing month. Emperor Tilian IV of Alphatia demanded the raids stop, as well as the constant smuggling of goods that were getting around Alphatian tariffs. Gabrionis V of Thyatis claimed that the empire did not sanction the pirates, and the smugglers were an Alphatian taxation issue they needed to deal with themselves. Both empires were in decline in the years leading up to the Spike Assault, each facing issues that had long plagued their societies. Alphatia's ruling wizards were almost completely disassociated with running the empire. The Grand Council of Wizards' attendance rate was less than 10% in most meetings. Zonga addiction was at an all-time high. And worse, the commoners were ignoring many of the laws that were in place to keep them from rising in power. Tilian IV was a hands-off ruler, caught up in his own interests with little desire to handle the duties of his post. When he finally decided to stand up to the Thyacians, He could only rouse support among the powerful nobility with threats and blackmail, causing his vassals to push back even further against his rule. Thyatis was in the grips of numerous corrupt senators before the war. Gabronius was an artistic man who let the military run itself while he focused on beautification projects and his works of art. In his 40 years as emperor, he never once initiated a conflict, believing that the reputation of Thyatis alone would deter any threats. Because of this, the legions were divided between incompetent generals, most of whom were senators, nobles, or the wealthy elite who had purchased ranks for themselves or their family members. Actual competent officers were restricted to the lower ranks, and worst, pushed into the furthest regions of the empire where their constant complaining about the lack of discipline, supplies, and quality troops couldn't be heard. While the elite First Legion was stationed in and around the capital, they were primarily used as bodyguards for their self-appointed generals or set pieces for their galas. It was the perfect storm for a war that would showcase the flaws of both empires. Tilion, in an attempt to appear decisive to his nobles and subjects, started making plans for the spike assault. His ultimate goal is to take Thyatis City and install a puppet ruler to follow the demands of Alphatia. While he's not military-minded, he does understand that a direct assault would result in all of the legions of Thyatis descending on his force. He has to divide his opponent's attention so his army won't face the legions at full strength. Tilion first turns to espionage and treachery to enact his plans. He knows many in Thyatis are only out for themselves, and he's going to have no problem finding traitors to assist in his plans. Agents reach out to Yuri Molotov, captain of the Order of the White Drake, the protectors of Thyatis City. Yuri was a native-born Trollodar and was offered the throne of his homeland if his order didn't resist when the invasion started. The first stage of the spike assault starts as another skirmish on the Isle of Dawn. Instead of a single regiment pushing against their opposite number in a single fort, Alphatia strikes in half a dozen locations with entire armies. The Empire had moved large numbers of their forces in secret for the attack, and the initial assault went beyond Tilion's expectations. Newkirk, Kendach, and West Portage fell within weeks of the attack. Thyatis responds by redeploying their legions to the island to retake their losses, except for the ones deployed near the capital. Those are still needed to guard senators and look good when they hold parties. The Thyacian response wasn't swift, but it was going to be overwhelming. By the time the various legions reached the Isle of Dawn, Alphatia had dug in and awaited the counterattack. The legions that arrived were some of the more competent, but they still lacked training and leadership and often dealt with weapons and armor that were insufficient. The Alphatians were pushed back slowly but steadily. It didn't help they had little magical support, and not much in the way of logistical help due to the entire attack being a feint. Tilion wasn't trying to hold the Isle of Dawn, but to lure Thyatis' military away from the capital for his big surprise. This came about in the autumn when Tilion's actual plan was enacted. The Alphatian navy, laden with troops, swept from behind the Isle of Dawn and made straight for Thyatis City. If Thyatis had been at full strength, the invasion would have been stopped in the narrow strait called Vanya's Girdle by the superior Thyacian fleet. Only the fleet had long been neglected. The corrupt leaders of Port Licinius had been embezzling monies meant for fleet repairs. The few seaworthy ships were at the Isle of Dawn dealing with the conflict there, leaving just a few converted merchant ships to stop the might of the Alphatian navy. The Battle of Vanya's Girdle became the greatest defeat in Thyatis' navy in history. Alphatia's forces reached Thyatis City and deployed tens of thousands of troops to secure the capital and seize the palace. Not all was going well for them either. Not a single member of the Council of Wizards was willing to help. They thought Tilion was weak and his military expedition was a distraction from their interests. He had no high-powered wizards and minimal air support. Most of the officers volunteered for the expedition were there for personal enrichment rather than the glory of Alphatia. It was a recipe for disaster. Initially, the battle went as planned. The Order of the White Drake refused to mobilize when the first airships appeared. The First Legion was held back to protect the individual senators' villas rather than face the Alphatians in the streets. The palace was breached. The Alphatian wizards hunted down the imperial family to exterminate their entire line. The attackers slew Emperor Gabronius, as well as 5 of his 6 children, with only Gabriella escaping the slaughter. Now all that remained was to secure the city, and victory would be assured. Enter Thrainkel Torsen, also known as Thrainkel the Brave, one of the most famous gladiators in all of Thyatis City. He sees the slaughter and notices the complete breakdown of the Alphatian army and the total absence of the First Legion. He ventures out with a few other gladiators to confront their attackers and easily defeats those who stand against him. In single combat, the Alphatians are no match for Thyacian gladiators, and there is no cohesion in the invading army. Thrainkel rallies his entire gladiator stable to him and defends their city. The gladiators prove to be unstoppable, as any and all discipline among the Alphatians is long gone. He moves his forces to other gladiator schools to recruit the warriors there. Eventually, he has a small army of gladiators and legionnaires willing to fight for their empire rather than some corrupt senator. The retaking of Thyatis City has begun. Thrainkel's palace to the Imperial Palace was not as straightforward as it seemed due to the fires from the battle and active pockets of resistance from Alphatian units who started to realize that people were starting to fight back. The future emperor uses his forces well, sending out legionnaires to face the disciplined troops and unleashing the gladiators against the pockets of looters.
Against the rank of Alphatian soldiers, the Alphatians break against the shield walls and are crushed against walls and other obstacles. The gladiators put on a show versus the pockets they face, terrorizing the drunken and out-of-control warriors by executing them in ways that would have drawn standing ovations in the Colosseum. Soon the Alphatians in the streets are dead or routed, and Thrainkel has a clear route to the palace. The Alphatian forces occupying the imperial palace are surprised when an impromptu army of gladiators and soldiers smash through the front gates and start slaughtering any enemies they can find. Thrainkel leads the charge, accompanied by many companions who would later become power players in Thyatis. Accompanying him include Triela Tientang, future Duke of Mositius, Augustine Nuor, later commander of the Pearl Island garrison, Layla bin Nadir, later commander of the Telak Bir Legion, Aper Octavian, who was awarded a Senate seat for his bravery, and Philopas Abete, another future senator, though not one of the good ones. Leading the legionnaires was Davos Astromentes, a mid-ranking officer who, after the battle, would be promoted to lead the First Legion for his gallantry. Astromentes was serving under the corrupt general of the First Legion, who was rather heroically holding the Legion back to protect his own mansion. Despite protests to go out and fight, the general decided that his own personal safety was more important than that of Thyatis City. Unfortunately, later in the night, he slipped and fell onto several swords held by his general officers, and in a strange twist of fate, accidentally decapitated himself. The legionnaires decided to honor their late commander, despite his tragic death, by actually going out and joining the fight. The battle for the palace was brief. The Alphatian leadership had no idea how badly discipline had broken down in their ordinary troops, and they didn't expect organized resistance, especially from gladiators and slaves. Thrainkel's forces went room by room looking for Alphatians, and those that didn't teleport away were killed to a man. Princess Gabriella was found in the company of the Alphatian commander, who decided to keep her as a slave and his personal war trophy. After ensuring she was safe, Thrainkel left her some bodyguards and secured the building. In a single day, the Spike Assault had sacked Thyatis City, and in the space of a single night, the invasion had been repulsed by a gladiator from Oceansend and an impromptu army. Thrainkel would quickly organize Thyacian troops after the battle to prevent a counter-assault. Astromentes claimed that the general of the First Legion had died in battle against the Alphatians, and he took over once his commander fell. It was apparent that the legionnaires had niedermiered their general, which should have gotten them executed. Thrainkel took this bald-faced lie as the truth, needing competent officers more than public executions. He had more than enough of them scheduled anyways. The future emperor even gave the dead general honors to maintain the lie. Astromentes responded to this promotion by purging the ranks of political appointees and incompetents. Thrainkel would, of course, become Emperor Thinkal, and within 3 years, the Alphatian gains in the Isle of Dawn would be reversed. Tilion would be forced to retire over the debacle, allowing his daughter, Ariadne, to assume the throne. Emperor Thinkal would then begin an effort to return the legions to their old glory, though he would maintain the peace between the empires for another 40 years. Thus concludes the story of the Spike Assault. I filled in some of the blanks with fluff to keep the canon, with minimal deviation. All of the information in this video primarily comes from Religions of Mystara over at the Vaults of Pandius, which makes it fanon. And it's held in such high regard it's considered official fanon. The Immortals are detailed in Wrath of the Immortals and expanded upon in the Codex Immortalis. I will be talking in detail about the Immortals I've never covered before, but glossing over the more common ones that have appeared repeatedly, like Ixion, Vanya, and Odin. But how many people have talked about Idriote, Carnelian, or Petura? The Church of Thyatis was established in the 2nd century AC by Empress Valencia to provide the empire with a unifying message that your duty is to Thyatis, and those who rule it in whatever capacity know what's best for you. This isn't just those currently ruling over you, but those who have ruled over the nation beforehand. People are to be loyal, trusting, willing, and respectful. This attitude preserves Thyatis, and by those means makes everybody's life better. The government responds to the trust given to it by the lay people by doing what is best in their interest. It sounds a bit draconian and self-serving on paper, but for the status-minded Thyacians, it perfectly encapsulates their philosophy. Sometimes you have to give a little to get a little. The church is highly structured, because it's Thyacian. All of the laws, tenets, and beliefs are written down and made available to every temple. They have a set procedure for every ritual, provide prayer books with approved and suggested hymns, and every part of the religion has been decided on by the Assembly of Elders and the Pontifex Maximus, or the Pontifex Magnus. He switches between those titles, which are the church leaders. Despite its rigid set of laws, it's not an oppressive religion. The tenets tell the faithful who to listen to when they have questions, but they don't lord over people and prefer simple guidance. It's a core belief that the meaning of life is sacrifice, and sacrifice is only worthy if it's done with free will. The church doesn't want brainwashed fanatics. It wants people who study the teachings and use them to get ahead in life under their merit. You are welcome to raise your family and live your life the way you want, just as long as it falls under Thyacian customs. 16 immortals form the pantheon of the Church. They are Vanya, Terastia, Asterius, Valerius, Coronis, Tyserius, Wayland, under the guise of Vulcan, Odin, Thor, Ixion, under the guise of Solarius, Isildur, Cagiar, Coreus, Hydriote, Carnelian, and Petura. These are not the founding members of the pantheon. Instead, these are the immortals that the Church has decided to add to their worship. Each one has helped Thyatis significantly in the past and has a sizable following in the Empire. New immortals can be added through the ritual of evocatio, but this is difficult to do and requires a mortal sponsor to convince the pontifex and a council of sages. If successful, a ritual is held in the great cathedral of Thyatis, where the pontifex welcomes the new patriarch of the Church, and the immortals' places of worship are formally absorbed into the Church of Thyatis. There are 5 steps necessary to petition the Church for the ritual of evocatio successfully, and the petitioners have to succeed at all of them to the satisfaction of the pontifex. The Church will hold tests for all these conditions, usually in a ceremony at one of the larger churches. The representative of the immortal in question will answer the questions, perform the tasks, or anything else that is required, and everything is considered. It doesn't have to be the same person for each test. It makes for a stronger case if multiple people are pushing for the immortal's inclusion. The first is the test of beliefs. The cult must obtain permission to build a temple to their immortal in the Empire's borders. They have 1 month to make the structure, which doesn't need to be a large one, just big enough to hold services in. The Church proper will supervise the construction and, throughout the process, test the people involved on their beliefs, their immortal, and how they fit in with Phaeacian culture. If the observers are satisfied, the Church will be allowed to open. The second is the test of magic. This requires someone who is a cleric of the specific immortal to show that they can cast clerical magic on command. This can be proven with abilities provided to clerics of a supernatural origin, like turning undead or manifesting a cleric ability specific to the followers of the immortal, such as Ka's gift of infravision to his followers. This is an easy test to pass, which is why it's early on the list. It's easy to spot a charlatan who can't even produce a spell. The third test is the test of deeds. The cult wishing to join has to perform a task that benefits the whole of Thyatis. This should coincide with the philosophy of the immortal, demonstrating that the cult benefits society as a whole. Petura, patron of motherhood, has numerous hospitals built by her cult devoted to childbirth and children. In contrast, Carnelian, patron of machitos and tradition, had her cult help rebuild the duchy after it was stripped of resources with the departure of Stephen Karamikos. The cult will have to convince the council that their deeds are worthy, and only then will they be allowed to proceed to the next phase. The test of numbers is easy to pass, but it might require some time to accomplish, so it's one of the last trials needed. Simply enough, the cult must have 100 members to qualify for the ritual. The required number of members has to be inside the borders of Thyatis, but not all of them need to live there. When the Church has enough followers, they hold a service where the required number is present, and the council will do a head count and ask random questions to followers to ensure they are true believers. The last test is the test of leadership, and this is where the politicking starts. The cult has to select a leader and present him or her to the pontifex. The leader has to impress the pontifex with their devotion and their capability. Bootlicking isn't required, but it is highly appreciated. If the pontifex rejects the leader, the process starts all over. However, if the pontifex approves, the cult leader is named the new elder, and the cult is officially absorbed into the Church of Thyatis to much fanfare. This is a rare event, happening maybe a dozen times in 8 centuries. So now that we know how an immortal cult joins the Church of Thyatis, what are the primary beliefs? Like the 5 steps for joining, there are 5 primary beliefs that the devout are expected to follow. Thyacians take breaking these rules very seriously. In extreme cases, not only are you stripped of any rank in the Church, excommunicated and shunned, but the Church can have your very citizenship taken away. As the Church is part of the Thyacian government, the power is immense. Don't go around paying lip service to your beliefs. That will end badly. The first belief is loyalty to the state. This is the most essential part of the Church, and the most cardinal sin you can commit is to betray or lie to a high-ranking member of the Church or government. Likewise, the highest honor you can receive is martyrdom to Thyatis. To the Church, the words of the Emperor and the Pontifex Maximus are held in equal measure. This section of the Church's teaching instructs the followers to obey the laws, not to question their superiors, and to further the goals of Thyatis as set by the leaders of the Empire. It relies heavily on the divine right of kings, and the immortals place the appropriate leaders to rule because they're the best choice. The second rule is the respect of tradition. This is compiled in the Liber Valentianus, the book of faith penned by the Empress Valencia at the start of the Church. This comprises every tradition the Church values, as voted upon by a group known as the Keepers of Tradition. They update the book based on the decisions of the Assembly of Elders and the Pontifex, adding new traditions and striking outdated ones. They are also in charge of mass-producing the book for the faithful. The most important traditions are acting fairly with their fellow Thyacians, making the world better, or at least more like Thyatis, keeping to the feast days, and listening to the seers known as the haruspices. Respect the immortals is the third rule, which involves following the mandates set down by the members of the Pantheon. In case of mixed signals, follow the teachings that best improve Thyatis. This rule also lists immortals to oppose, comprising certain entropic immortals like Thanatos, Orcus, and Alphax, plus the entire Alphatian Pantheon. Other cults, especially chaotic but well-meaning faiths like Taiki or Koratuku, are tolerated. The fourth rule is to respect the ancestors, commonly seen as mortals of outstanding achievements who didn't quite obtain immortality but have been canonized by the faith. Most families have at least one ancestor who accomplished a historic feat that they idolize as part of this teaching, even if history might have glossed over the actual events. These ancestors might not rise to the position of saint, but the main difference being that praying to a saint can sometimes lead to the gifting of spells. Many cults will argue that a revered saint is in secret an immortal, which causes all manners of theological arguments, like the one currently happening over Saint Lyanna, Emperor Thinkal's mother. The last rule is respect of neighbors. Thyacians are expected to be a unified people, and internal bickering does nothing to further their greatness. The Church strongly encourages its followers to avoid conflicts with fellow Thyacians and to settle arguments using Church mediators. Please note that this rule only applies to Thyacians. The follower is not obligated to play fair in any way if there is a dispute between outsiders, something the Church encourages. And you wonder why they have a reputation for treachery. The various ranks of clergy have their own vestments, denoting their position, rank, and duty. The only thing that all the garments share is the holy symbol displayed somewhere on them, usually their chest. The symbol for the Church of Thyatis is a crown encircling the blue imperial eagle, which is holding 2 lightning bolts, signifying the power of the pontifex, the emperor, and Thyatis' absolute dominance in 1980s van art competitions. The beginning rank is that of acolyte, which is every first-level cleric or layperson aspiring to join the faith. They have no spells, and they wear a brown long-sleeved robe down to their ankles. They are considered to be in training, so they rarely have weapons or armor unless approved by a higher-ranking cleric in order to start their adventuring career. Most people never meet acolytes because they're in studies. While the faithful can be of either sex without penalty, during their time as acolytes, men and women are kept separate to keep their minds on their studies. Actual clerics are at least second level and full church members. Their white robes will have a brown sash around the waist as a belt. They can openly carry weapons and armor if they are of an adventuring profession, but most spend their times in temples with little need to protect themselves. Most clerics, a full 80%, are considered philosophers who represent the teachings of the church as a whole. 18% are polytheistic clerics who teach the combined lessons of all the Pantheon's immortals. Lastly, 2% are specialists who teach the lessons just from a single specific immortal. The philosopher clerics look down on these guys, and as such, they have little power inside the church. There are numerous holy orders in the Church of Thyatis, which clerics can join if invited. It's not mandatory to join an order, and most clerics don't. The Haruspices are diviners tasked once a month to evaluate the predictions of oracles and translate any omens, dreams, or visions. Hospitaliers run various houses of healing across the empire. Guardians are tasked with protecting holy sites and high-ranking church officials. Itinerants have no set home and travel to where the immortals send them. They make up a large number of adventuring clerics. Militants are the armed branch of the church and hunt down heretics and assist in army operations. Missionaries are only found outside the empire, protecting its interests. Thanatologists are tasked with hunting undead and performing funerary rites on the dead. Lastly, the theologians study the teachings of the church and serve as advisors to high-ranking members of the Thyacian government. Next in rank are the curates, who must be of at least 5th level. These are administrators of the church and administer a curia, a church district around 1,000 followers in each of them. They wear white robes with gilded sleeves, a purple sash as a belt, and a silver ring with the holy symbol. Many of the orders looking into seeing if an immortal is worthy of joining the church or someone is deserving of sainthood are comprised entirely of curates. The prophets are at least 7th level and rule over all the curias in a given province. They wear black tunics with gold embroidery with a white sash. They carry a silver scepter, a gold medallion, and a monogrammed ring. They determine the course of action for the church in their chosen territory and rule over the curates, ensuring that they don't deviate too far from the teachings. Every curate in a region answers to the same prophet. The elder patriarchs are part of the assembly of the elders. They dress in long red silk robes with a white sash, a gold medallion, monogrammed ring, and carry a golden scepter. They appoint the prophets and determine what's appropriate for the faith's followers, making many of the most difficult decisions. There is exactly one elder for every immortal in the Pantheon, but elders don't have to represent a specific immortal. The Pontifex Magnus is the ruler of the church and second only to the emperor in terms of political power. In theory, if a pontifex were to act against Thincal actively, the church would soon need to promote another pontifex, preferably one that doesn't lose his head. The pontifex wears a simple white robe with a jeweled staff and the pontiff's ring on his finger, an ancient artifact from the time of Empress Valencia. He answers only to the emperor, but the lower councils can remove him if necessary. This has happened maybe twice since the founding of the church.
Despite their massive amount of rules and power, the church is limited in civil ceremonies, leaving marriages up to the state laws. A couple can be married by a priest, but it isn't a requirement of the faith. They can just as easily be married by a civil servant or even a high-ranking family member in the government. The exceptions to this peculiar hands-off approach are funerals and coronations. The emperor cannot take the throne without the blessing of the pontifex, keeping the power concentrated at the top. When a Thyacian dies, they have to undergo many ceremonies to prepare them for the afterlife and their journey back to the land of the living. This ceremony is not optional and is one of the oldest laws in the Liber Valentianus. Ignoring this ceremony is an excellent way to get excommunicated. Of the immortals worshipped in the pantheon, not all of them are worshipped as equals. The longer an immortal has been part of the pantheon, the more power their particular clerics hold. There is a pecking order among the elders, with the followers of Vanya holding the most respect. Of note is Ixion, who fell from favor in the church after the Ispan affair, where his teachings ran counter to the others in handling the removal of the Ispan people to the Red Coast. His clerics have lost much influence, but not enough to get them expelled from the pantheon. This is an unusual position for the clerics of Ixion, who were quite used to their elevated status. Of the immortals, I've covered most of them in videos I did on the spheres of power, as they represent some of the most famous and influential. All temples will have them represented in a fresco or as an icon. Many have a small shrine devoted to them individually. A few places of worship focus on just one immortal. The most famous is the original church, erected as part of the ritual of evocatio. Followers of those particular immortals will often perform a pilgrimage to that building, coming from other nations as part of their faith. There are 4 immortals that I've never covered before, being lesser known, though not necessarily weaker. They just have smaller domains than, say, sun or war. Tiresias is the patron of dreams, prophecy, poetry, music, and bards. He predates the rise of the Millennian Empire, being born during the time of the ancient Traldar. He was famous for his accurate predictions and wise counsel, but was betrayed by a jealous queen and blinded and exiled for his troubles. He saw the coming of the Beastmen and pleaded with the Hutakans to aid the humans in the upcoming war, but they locked themselves away and banished him once again. The bard traveled with the future founder of the Millennian Empire, and that's where he ascended to immortality. He is a friendly immortal with numerous allies. He's also famous for always answering in a riddle, song, or poem. He attracts followers of all persuasions, even ones that have little in common with each other. Idriote is the patron of Thyacian magic and wizards. He is of Arabic descent, not Yulari. He comes from the same world as the D'Ambervilles and the McGregors, only by a different means. He was trying to summon one little major demon, and instead found himself gated to Mystara, right before the Thyacian rebellion. Thankfully, he ended up in Tel Akbir, so he could pass himself as one of the natives there. He allied with General Licinius, who promised Idriote his own magic school if he would help with one little assassination and kill all the other allied kings in order for Licinius to secure the imperial throne for himself. The wizard agreed, fully aware that Licinius might turn on him as well, but he thought there was a chance that he could convince the general to keep his word. However, he was later approached by Licinius' right-hand man, Zendrolian, who offered Idriote the same deal, in exchange for one little massive betrayal in killing Licinius. Zendrolian kept his word, needing a powerful wizard and having killed the previous most powerful wizard, being Licinius. Idriote later ascended and spent his immortality researching new forms of magic and new types of science. Carnelian is the patron of tradition, nobility, and the Duchy of Mositius. She proves that anyone can become immortal through their efforts and talents. In her case, her talents were bureaucratic skills beyond that of mere mortals. She was born into nobility, and her father ruled over what would become the Duchy of Mositius. Here we've got our first continuity snarl, because it says her mother was an elf and her father was human, which means she should have been an elf. So cheat and say her mother was a human born of elves. She becomes the ruler of the Dimrock Forest after the death of her parents, and she realizes it was doomed unless she could bring civilization to the area. So she marries Senator Alexandros Keramikos and uses her training, natural intelligence, and wealth to turn a backwater settlement into a full-blown duchy. When her son was grown, her husband passed away, so she gave her title to her heir and joined the clergy to serve Thyatis further. There she reached the rank of Pontifex Maximus and was allowed to ascend to immortality. She is naturally the most popular immortal in her former domain, but she feels betrayed by her ancestor Stephen Keramikos and has nothing to do with his new nation. Secretly, she's torn, as she feels that society dictated her life and she missed out on many of its joys. She's contemplating indulging in all the passions she ignored in her life and abandoning her duties, at least for a while. Patura is the patron of Thyacian women and motherhood and the former empress of Thyatis. In her mortal life, she was Pausania Monomachus, daughter of Valeria II. She took the throne in 643 AC when her brother Adrian and her family were lost at sea. She became the empress at age 20 and was seen as a puppet by various senators and generals looking to make her their wife. This made Pausania distrustful of men and earned her the moniker of the Virgin Empress. She significantly improved the lot of Thyacian women by placing them in positions of power, but this caused the men that they replaced to plot against her.
When she discovered the plot, she executed the traitors on the advice of her spiritual advisor, a woman named Daphne. But then the priestess encouraged the Empress not to stop there, and soon she targeted anyone who had spoken ill of her. The Senate deposed her for exceeding her power, and even the immortal Ixion turned his back on her. She spent some time on a rampage of revenge until the priestess Daphne ordered her to kill the children of the Patriarch of Ixion. Then she realized how far she had fallen and turned on her advisor, who turned out to be a demonic creature sent to corrupt the Empress. So, good job, Daphne. After years of penance, she was finally forgiven by Ixion and later ascended to immortality. Now she still deals with the guilt of all the murders she committed, but she is also fiercely devoted to mothers and, more importantly, children. That's the Church of Thyatis. It turned out to be a rather large topic compared to the other religions because Thyacians love their rules, and Italians love to write about epic stuff. Now you have a lot of background information to use if your adventurers ever find themselves in the Empire. Maybe they even meet the Pontifex. But it's up to you to name them because Marco left that part off.